A really high quality of life that is really hard to match anywhere else in the world.
We don't believe in closed doors. We believe in the horizon. Because great ideas don't need walls, they need space to grow. So what makes this place different?
The weather, the people, and the research facilities to make your career thrive.
The young and collaborative environment.
That really helps me to be better at my own research.
Because we've mastered the art of connection. Our labs talk to the ocean. Our startups talk to the world. It's an ecosystem where you're not just a researcher. You're a pioneer backed by the resources to go further. And you? Will you step in?
We have the most amazing natural lab, which is the here Formosa.
Imagine 60 kilometers of pure natural wonder right at your doorstep. Most people see it as the perfect place to disconnect and recharge. But for us, it's much more than a beautiful view. It's an open-air extension of our campus, a truly living workspace where the ocean drives your discovery. But what makes this place so special? You'll be working alongside people who don't just understand your vision, they push it further. What happens when nature becomes part of your research team?
And having access to these people, worldwide experts right on your doorstep, is hugely beneficial for my own research.
So, is it all work and no play? Not even close. Here, your office is minutes away from world-class surf, golden cliffs, and the pulse of a city that never stays still. From summer festivals that light up the night, to the quiet heat of a Mediterranean afternoon, we understand that a brilliant mind needs a life to match. So tell us, why settle for a gray sky when you can have this?
I've come here with my family and my 2 children, and it's a wonderful place.
You can be outdoors most of the year, and that is a huge improvement on many European cities, I would say.
Really make it one of the best places to live.
I feel there's a wind of change in the air that really makes me want to be part of it.
Join us. Bring your talent. Find your balance. Because here, you don't just study the future, you help shape it. Start here as an early-stage researcher. University of Algarve, where innovation, research, and quality of life meet. You know that spark? That moment in research when a theory finally hits the real world? What if that moment wasn't rare? What if it was part of everyday? You know that spark? That moment in research when a theory finally hits the real world? What if that moment wasn't rare? What if it was part of everyday life? In the south of Portugal, we don't just study the future, we live it. Here, the University of Algarve is more than a campus. With over 80 master's and doctoral degrees, it's a high-performance hub built on its areas of excellence: marine sciences, archaeology, health, and tourism. But why here?
The priority is good science, not quick results, which I think is hugely beneficial.
Combined with a really high quality of life that is really hard to match anywhere else in the world.
We don't believe in closed doors. We believe in the horizon. Because great ideas don't need walls, they need space to grow. So what makes this place different?
The weather, the people, and the research facilities to make your career thrive.
The young and collaborative environment.
That really helps me to be better at my own research.
Because we've mastered the art of connection. Our labs talk to the ocean. Our startups talk to the world. It's an ecosystem where you're not just a researcher. You're a pioneer backed by the resources to go further. And you? Will you step in?
We have the most amazing natural lab, which is the here Formosa.
Imagine 60 kilometers of pure natural wonder right at your doorstep. Most people see it as the perfect place to disconnect and recharge. But for us, it's much more than a beautiful view. It's an open-air extension of our campus, a truly living workspace where the ocean drives your discovery. But what makes this place so special? You'll be working alongside people who don't just understand your vision, they push it further. What happens when nature becomes part of your research team?
And having access to these people, worldwide experts right on your doorstep, is hugely beneficial for my own research.
So, is it all work and no play? Not even close. Here, your office is minutes away from world-class surf, golden cliffs, and the pulse of a city that never stays still. From summer festivals that light up the night, to the quiet heat of a Mediterranean afternoon, we understand that a brilliant mind needs a life to match. So tell us, why settle for a gray sky when you can have this?
I've come here with my family and my 2 children, and it's a wonderful place.
You can be outdoors most of the year, and that is a huge improvement on many European cities, I would say.
Really make it one of the best places to live.
I feel there's a wind of change in the air that really makes me want to be part of it.
Join us. Bring your talent. Find your balance. Because here, you don't just study the future, you help shape it. Start here as an early stage researcher. University of Algarve, where innovation, research, and quality of life meet. You know that spark?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Diana Duarte, and it is with a great pleasure that I welcome you to the University of the Algarve for the public session of the 3rd International Portugal-USA Summer Course in Cancer Research. Throughout this week, this international course has brought together some of the world's leading researchers in oncology, providing young scientists with a unique opportunity for learning and direct contact with international leaders in cancer research. This initiative is a part of the USAPT Initiatives Against Cancer, UPIC, which promotes scientific collaboration between Portugal and the United States of America, building strategic partnerships and advancing higher education in biomedical research. This course had the excellent scientific coordinators, Professor Pedro Castelo Branco and Professor Caterina Politi. To begin this welcome session, I would like to invite to the stage Alexandra Teodósio, Rector of the University of Algarve.
Good afternoon, all. Your Excellency, the Vice President of the Algarve Regional Coordination Commission for Development in the Health Sector, Dr. Patricia Nunes Rego, distinguished Nobel laureates Professor William Kaelin and Professor James Allison, dear Professor Pamdin Sharma and dear Professor Ronaldo de Pinho, dear Dr. Tiago Botelho, Director of our Regional Unit of Health in Algarve, dear colleagues from the UAlg rectoral team, dear directors of faculties and schools, dear coordinators of services, dear moderators and organizers, Professor Caterina Politi and Professor Pedro Castelo Branco, dear PhD candidates and students, dear colleagues, guests and friends, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor and a true pleasure to welcome you to the University of Algarve for this public session for the summer course in cancer research, dedicated to training early-stage researchers in the field devoted to the care of human health. We are privileged to host this afternoon 2 Nobel Prize laureates in physiology and medicine. Their presence here is a distinction for our university and for our region and for the broader scientific and academic community gathered here today. We are equally honored to welcome Professor Sharma and Professor de Pinho, whose participation further reflects the exceptional scientific level of this initiative. The themes addressed in this summer course remind us of the depth, complexity, and urgency of the contemporary cancer research, from the molecular mechanisms of tumor biology to immunotherapy, from resistance and response to a broader challenge of understanding, preventing, and intercepting cancer. This is a field where science lives change and lives based on transdisciplinary approaches. For the University of Algarve, hosting this event is especially meaningful. We are a public university deeply rooted in the Algarve, spread across several campi, close connected in our region. We are increasingly engaged also in international academies and research networks. We have a distinctive characteristic of being both a research university and also an applied science university. And in this aspect, we are rather unique in Portugal due to the balance of the 2 subsystems within our universities. So UAlg brings together education, science, innovation, practical, professional and public engagement in the way that is both regional grounded and international connected. The University of Algarve is a young university. We have less than 50 years, but we are close. We are approaching really quickly. And the University of Algarve, it's also a medium-sized university and a comprehensive institution where a little bit more than 11,000 students and 1,500 staff spread across our 3 campi and are also from the east to the west regions in Algarve. We bring together a broad portfolio of programs from shorter cycle of technical higher education courses, from bachelor to integrated masters to professional masters and also doctoral degrees. Research is one of the defined pillars of our identity, with international recognized research units and hubs in areas such as marine and environmental science, archaeology, heritage, tourism, and health. Our campus hosts students from more than 110 nationalities, reflecting a true international academic environment. This international outlook is one of the UAlg's strong assets and has been consistently observed in the Times Higher Education rankings, where the University of Algarve has stood out national for its international profile, while also achieving relevant recognitions in sustainability ranking also by the KES and also the Times Higher Education, where we are usually in the top 100 positions regarding sustainable development goals, like the Sustainable Development Goals number 2, Zero Hunger, number 5, Gender Equality, Sustainable Consumption and Production, Sustainable Development Goal number 12, Climate Action, but also the protection of life below water and also life on land. And the most important score we are also receiving in the Sustainable Development Goal partnerships for the goals. All are committed to the most important aim, that it's leave no one behind. For this UAlg position, we are also recognized in the International Science ranking, what is also showing a commitment for the sustainability science and to the resilience of our society and planet. In the field of health in particular, the University of Algarve has built a strong and increasingly integrated ecosystem of teaching and research. And the teaching, it's also very well recognized with innovative pedagogies. And this included the School of Health and especially the Faculty of Medicine and Biomedical Science, the Algarve Biomedical Center Research Institute, the Center of Biomedical Research, the Center of Health Studies and Development, the Algarve Academic Center for Biomedical Research and Training, and also the Algarve Biomedic Collaborative Laboratory, and other research hubs that are working across biomedical science, clinical research, health, innovation, and also aging. This, in this same spirit, it's also visible our work in the integrated master in medicine, as I was mentioned, widely recognized as an innovative program in Portugal, built on a problem-based learning and active collaborative learning. This public session is therefore much more than a ceremony moment. It's an opportunity to place our community and our young researchers indirect contact with scientific leaderships and also their peers. And it's also an opportunity to remind ourselves that universities must remain places where discovery is the purpose with excellence, but also with responsibility, generosity, and public purposes. Cancer research is not only a matter for laboratories and hospitals, it's also a matter of public responsibility, strategic commitment, and social justice. And let me finish with a quote attributed to Egas Muniz, a Portuguese neurologist and Nobel laureate in medicine. Innovation in medicine arises from the courage to question what seems definitive. And I warmly welcome you again and wish you an inspiring and a lot of sustainable innovation that may arise from this afternoon. I would like also to express my sincere gratitude to all those who made this initiative possible, to the organizer, mainly Katrina and Pedro, but also to the speakers, moderators, partners, supporters of this initiative. So on the behalf of the University of Algarve, thank you very much.
So, thank you. I would now like to present Professor Caterina Politi from Yale University and Professor Pedro Castelo Branco, Vice-Rector of the University of Algarve. Professor Caterina Politi, an international renowned researcher specializing in lung cancer biology and mechanisms of resistance. Her laboratory has contributed to understanding tumor molecular evolution and to the development of the new therapeutic strategies. Professor Pedro Castelo Branco is internationally recognized for his work on epigenetic and cancer biology. His research has contributed to a deeper understanding of the molecular mechanisms involved in tumor development and progression, advancing the University of Algarve and the Algarve Biomedical Center as a center of excellence in biomedical research. Professor Pedro Castelo Branco and Professor Caterina, please join us.
Good afternoon all. Dear Rector of the University of Algarve, dear rectoral team, my colleagues, dear directors of faculties and schools here present, dear President of the Algarve Health Unit, dear health professionals, dear President of the Algarve Clinical Academic Center, dear representatives of CCDR Algarve, dear representatives of Faro and Lagoa municipalities, dear President of Lolé Municipality, dear Professor Politi, co-organizer of this event, dear guests from all over Portugal and the US, dear colleagues, distinguished speakers, dear students. Welcome to the third International Summer Course in Cancer Research public session. A few years ago, Professor Ronaldo Pinho had an idea. And this was to work on a strategy that would bring together exceptional American and Portuguese cancer scientists together. He contacted the most prestigious academic institutions in the US and convinced several leaders in the field to come to Portugal and meet our scientists. It was then created the Portugal-USA Cancer Initiative. Professor De Pinho put together a team of scientists and fundraisers, and it hasn't stopped ever since. Supported by this initiative, Portuguese scientists have already visited the US and set up remarkable collaborations. More will do the same in the future, I'm sure. Another initiative was to create a summer school in cancer research. And according to Professor De Pinho, the best summer school in cancer research in the world. And I think that this was achieved. Thank you to US-Portugal Cancer Initiative team. Thank you to all our sponsors. And thank you, Professor Ron De Pinho. Thank you, Ron. We just had a unique long event here in the Algarve where these very lucky 30 students had the privilege to interact with an exquisite group of cancer researchers. And here we are today for the public session of this course. Our guests are individuals with unique careers that shape the way on how we understand cancer, and also the way on how we treat cancer. Thank you, Professor Kalin. Thank you, Professor Sharma, Professor De Pino, and Professor Allinson, for having accepted our invitation. It is an immense honor to have you here today. I will now pass the word to Professor Politi to say a few words and introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Castelo Branco. Boa tarde. Good afternoon. Thank you very Oh, here we go. Is it working now?
Yes.
It's working now. Okay. So we've had a wonderful week here and have very much enjoyed Algarvian hospitality. What a beautiful part of the world. It is with great honor that we begin this public seminar series with a presentation from one of the most distinguished scientists of our time. Dr. William Kalin is a professor at Harvard University and a researcher at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. He received his medical degree from Duke University, further medical training at Johns Hopkins, then moved to Boston, where he did a fellowship and worked with the late Dr. David Livingston. He started his laboratory in 1992 there. Dr. Kalin has had a long-standing interest in understanding mechanisms of tumor suppression. Stemming from these studies, he made fundamental discoveries on how cells sense and adapt to oxygen levels. These advances opened new therapeutic perspectives for various diseases, including cancer. And for this work, he received the 2019 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine, together with Peter Ratcliffe and Greg Semenza. Dr. Kalin, I'd like to welcome you to the stage. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for the privilege of visiting this magnificent country and for participating in this very important initiative. And if I could have the first slide. We've already had the microphone problem, so that's taken care of. So now we just have to see. Oh, here we go, good. So when I was a young person, I was sure I was going to be a clinical doctor. So here I am about the same age as some of our students. And because I was a clinical doctor, I learned about a number of rare diseases, including von Hippel-Lindau disease. So this is a disease that affects about 1 in 35,000 people around the world, including in Portugal. And it's characterized by an inherited predisposition to cancer. So every place you see a filled circle or square, that patient has developed some form of cancer. And the typical cancers include the most common form of kidney cancer, which is one of the most common cancers in the developed world. Blood vessel tumors called hemangioblastomas of the brain, spinal cord, and eye, and tumors of the peripheral nervous system called neural crest tumors or paragangliomas. And I was sure I was going to be a clinical doctor, but then I went to Boston, as you just heard, to complete my clinical oncology training. And I had the very good fortune of working for a few years with the great David Livingston, who we sadly lost 2 years ago. And he took me under his wing and taught me how to become a scientist, how to think like a scientist, much to my surprise. And so the take-home message here for the students is the importance of finding great mentors and great role models. So I'd worked in David Livingston's lab on a particular gene called the retinoblastoma gene, which is a so-called tumor suppressor gene. It's a gene that causes cancer through its inactivation. And shortly after I started my own laboratory, The gene that, when altered or defective, causes von Hippel-Lindau disease was isolated by this group shown here. And for reasons I'll share with you in a minute, I thought this would be the perfect problem to work on as a newly minted scientific investigator. Now, I was told that there might be some non-scientists in the room, and no one has ever gotten angry at me because I made them feel smart. So we're going to have a molecular biology 101, if you will, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So you may know that your DNA is made up of 4 building blocks that we represent with the letters A, G, C, T. And if a region of DNA contains the instructions for making a protein, we refer to that as a gene. And so when the cell wants to make more of this particular protein with this information in the gene, the information in the DNA gets copied into another molecule called RNA, and in particular messenger RNA, that has these characteristic little poly A tails on the end. So you can think of these as the blueprint copies of the master blueprint, the gene. And then these instructions get sent to the factory floor to make the protein. And whereas there are 4 building blocks that make up your DNA, there are 20 building blocks that make up proteins. We refer to them as amino acids, and each of them has a different letter code. So here, there's a segment of the protein that has the building blocks we represent with L, A, P, G, and V. Now, the problem is cancers often have mutations or alterations in these different blueprints, and this can have disastrous consequences. So here, at the top, there's been a single change to the DNA, this substitution that leads now to this incorrect T being inserted. But unfortunately, this changes the instructions in the blueprint and can lead to the wrong building block being incorporated into the protein. And this literally is an example of a mutation that in some families is responsible for their von Hippel-Lindau disease. So if they're born with this defect in a single base in their DNA, it can be disastrous. Now, one little last piece of jargon. Scientists sometimes talk about genes being on or off, or expressed, not expressed. What they're really referring to is whether that copier machine is active. So on the left, the copier machine is active, you're making more of the protein, and that's often under the control of a type of protein we refer to generically as a transcription factor. So on the left, the transcription factor is activating the Xerox machine. On the right, the Xerox machine is off. Now let's look a little more deeply at people with von Hippel-Lindau disease. So people with von Hippel-Lindau disease have inherited a defective version of the VHL gene from mom or dad. In this schematic, it's the maternal copy that's defective. And you may know that your genes and your DNA is organized in so-called chromosomes. So what I'm showing you here schematically are the maternal and the paternal copy of the chromosome where the VHL gene would reside. But initially, they're okay because they have the remaining normal copy from the other parent. But unfortunately, if they're born like this, they have a 90% chance that the remaining normal copy will be spontaneously lost or mutated, and that's the cell that will go on to form a tumor. Now, as you would predict from the knowledge that inheriting a defective copy of the VHL gene predisposes you to kidney cancer, if you now look at run-of-the-mill, non-hereditary kidney cancer, you again see that both copies of the VHL gene are frequently mutated or defective or lost. But here, these mutational events have occurred sometime after conception, in contrast to VHL disease, where the first mutation was inherited from mom or dad. Now, I knew from my clinical training that the tumors seen in von Hippel-Lindau disease are very rich in blood vessels. In other words, they're very angiogenic. In fact, here I'm showing you on the left a hemangioblastoma, and on the right a kidney cancer after the patient has been injected with a fluorescent dye that the radiologist can easily visualize. And you see this abundance of new blood vessels, both on the left and on the right. I also knew from my clinical training that there are many reasons why patients can start to produce too many red blood cells. This is the opposite of anemia, where you have too few red blood cells. And so at the top of this list are things that kind of make sense. For example, if you move to Mount Everest, or you have certain heart and lung conditions, you're going to want to make more red blood cells so you can carry oxygen more efficiently. But it was also known that certain tumors, curiously enough, cause patients to make too many red blood cells. And it always struck me as odd that the 3 tumors you see in von Hippel-Lindau disease are on this list, especially given the fact that hemangioblastomas and these paragangliomas or pheochromocytomas are relatively rare. So a lot of science is just seeing possible connections. Because of my clinical training, as I just told you, I was aware that von Hippel-Lindau associated tumors are very rich in blood vessels, and that's because they produce a factor we call vascular endothelial growth factor, which you can think of as sort of a fertilizer for blood vessels. And I told you these tumors sometimes cause patients to make too many red blood cells, and that's because these tumors sometimes inappropriately make a hormone called erythropoietin. And so what VEGF and erythropoietin have in common is that they're normally induced when cells are not getting enough oxygen, presumably as a way to try to increase oxygen delivery. And so that was the clue that by studying the VHL gene and its protein product, we might actually learn something about oxygen sensing, and this seemed like an important problem because oxygen plays a role in many diseases, including cancer. So we then did a simple experiment, and for the students, simple is not bad, simple is good. Do the simplest experiment that answers the question. We generated in the laboratory kidney cancer cell lines where the VHL protein was absent or defective, or the VHL protein was normal or present, but otherwise these cells were identical. We then grew the cells in chambers that had low oxygen or high oxygen, and then we measured certain RNAs that are normally only upregulated or produced when oxygen is low, and they have this fancy name of hypoxia-inducible mRNAs, but hypoxia simply means low oxygen. So for example, VEGF I alluded to a moment ago is a hypoxia-inducible RNA. And what we found was when the VHL protein was present, as expected, these RNAs only accumulated under low oxygen conditions, whereas when the VHL protein was absent or defective, now these RNAs were produced whether or not oxygen was available. So this really confirmed our hypothesis that somehow oxygen sensing required an intact version of the VHL protein. In fact, years later, someone referred to this as the first harpoon in the whale, that we were going to get the answer once we had the first harpoon in the whale. Now, what I didn't tell you was the VHL protein didn't know or didn't look like other known proteins at the time, but you can tell a lot about a person by the company they keep, and likewise you can tell a lot about a protein by the company it keeps. So we did very standard biochemical experiments and found that the VHL protein bound to 2 other proteins or 3 other proteins, including alongin C, alongin B, and Col2. And this was a big break in the story and also underscores the importance of basic fundamental research, because people who were working on yeast, of all things, and studying the control of protein turnover in yeast, had discovered that in yeast there are complexes on the right that look like the complexes on the left. And in particular, SCIP1 in yeast looks like the human protein alongin C, and the yeast protein CDC53 looks like the human protein Col2. And these 2 proteins, when bound to a so-called F-box protein, generates what scientists refer to as a ubiquitin ligase. Now, I apologize for the jargon, but what this means is this complex can chemically attach a little flag or tail made up of these little so-called UB moieties here, and this serves as a signal for this protein to then be targeted for destruction by a cellular garbage disposal we refer to as the proteasome. So we began to think this was a similar complex that might target some protein or proteins for destruction, and we had a good guess as to what those proteins might be, because many of these genes that are activated by low oxygen are under the control of a transcription factor, and you're now experts in transcription factors, so this is going to be the switch to turn on these genes. This switch here is the transcription factor we refer to as hypoxia-inducible factor, or HIF for short, and we knew from the work of many labs that HIF actually has 2 proteins, an alpha subunit and a beta subunit, and the alpha subunit is normally destroyed if oxygen is plentiful, hence hypoxia-inducible factor. So at this point, Sir Peter Ratcliffe, with whom I shared the Nobel Prize, did a very important study. He had read our earlier paper, but rather than measuring hypoxia-inducible RNAs, he measured the abundance of HIF-alpha, and what he found was that in the cells lacking the VHL protein, there was an inappropriate persistent accumulation of HIF-alpha, even when oxygen was plentiful. And so based on that clue, we and others went on to show that this indeed is a so-called ubiquitin ligase that targets HIF-alpha for destruction when oxygen levels are high. But if oxygen levels are low or the VHL protein is defective, such as in kidney cancer, now HIF-alpha can accumulate inappropriately, bind to its partner protein HIF-beta, and activate genes such as VEGF. Now this still begs the question, however, how does the VHL protein know whether oxygen is or is not available, and hence whether it should or should not interact with HIF-alpha? And in work that we did and Sir Peter Ratcliffe did working in parallel, we discovered that in the presence of oxygen, one of those special building blocks in proteins that we recognize with the letter P for proline has a chemical modification that depends on oxygen called hydroxylation, and this generates a binding site for the VHL protein. And even I could appreciate that this provided a very intimate link with oxygen availability because the O here literally is an oxygen atom. Now, it's slightly more nuanced than that, so the enzymes that do the work here are called the EGLN or PHD proteins, and an enzyme is simply a protein that accelerates a chemical reaction. So these proteins take ambient or molecular oxygen, and they split the oxygen into the two oxygen atoms, and then they use one of the oxygen atoms to make that little flag that then generates a VHL binding site. Now, it immediately became apparent that you could inhibit these enzymes with chemicals that would interfere with this chemical on the lower left here called 2-oxyglutarate. So 2-oxyglutarate is a mouthful, but these enzymes also require a metabolite called 2-oxyglutarate in order for this chemical reaction to move forward. It became clear you could develop drugs that would compete with 2-oxyglutarate, would inactivate this enzyme, and would trick the body into thinking it wasn't getting enough oxygen because you're now turning off this particular oxygen sensing mechanism. And this would then cause patients to start making more red blood cells. And so, in fact, there are a number of these orally available drugs, so you can take these as a pill, that trick the body into thinking it's not getting enough oxygen, and you start making more red blood cells. And so here are 4 that are in relatively late stages of development. They've been approved in many countries around the world. I've been involved with roxadustat. That's been approved in over 40 countries around the world for the treatment of anemia in patients who don't make enough red blood cells. It's been approved in China since, I think, 2018. I'm told there are over 250,000 Chinese patients alone who take this drug every day as a means of supporting their red blood cell production. But my day job is as a cancer biologist, and so to me the real question was, okay, but how does this link to cancer? So we have a correlation. When you lose the VHL protein, you have too much HIF. I could imagine ways that HIF might cause cancer, but I always warn students, correlation plus plausibility is not the same as proof of causation. You have to do the rigorous experiments in the laboratory. I think you've heard about that from other speakers as well this week. So using modern molecular biology tools, we went into the laboratory, we manipulated HIF activity in cancer cells, kidney cancer cells grown on plastic dishes, as well as in mice. And we found it really was a HIF problem, but to our surprise, it was particularly a problem with one member of the HIF family we refer to as HIF2 alpha, and it was not a problem driven by the more famous member of the family, HIF1 alpha. In fact, if anything, HIF1 alpha seemed to be suppressing kidney tumor formation, and in a lot of kidney tumors, they simply silence HIF1 altogether because they like HIF2. HIF2 is the one that's promoting kidney cancer, and it turns out many of the other VHL-associated tumors as well. So what could we do about this? Well, by the 90s, a number of pharmaceutical companies were already developing drugs against VEGF, and we argued these drugs, if they were going to work in any solid tumor, should work in kidney cancer because of this direct link between VHL loss, upregulation of HIF, and upregulation of VEGF. And the good news is that turned out to be true. So here is the list of VEGF inhibitors that are approved for the treatment of kidney cancer in the United States. So that's the good news. But the bad news is not every kidney cancer patient treated with a VEGF inhibitor will respond. And even those that do respond will typically progress within 1 or 2 years. So we have to do better. So I hope some of our brilliant young students are already thinking, well, why would you bother targeting a single gene that's under HIF control? Why wouldn't you target HIF itself? And if you believe your own data, why wouldn't you target HIF2 specifically? That would seem to be the solution. That's what your laboratory experiment said. But the conventional wisdom, quote unquote, was that this was an undruggable target. So for the students, beware of conventional wisdom. So fortunately, 2 very bright scientists, Rick Bruick and Kevin Gardner, who were then at UT Southwestern, ignored this dogma, ignored this conventional wisdom, and they found a potentially druggable pocket in the so-called PAS-B domain of HIF2 alpha. And again, I apologize for the jargon, but suffice it to say there's a pocket here that can accept a small organic chemical with drug-like properties. They identified chemical matter that could bind to this pocket and change the folding of this protein such that it could no longer bind to DNA. These chemicals were then out-licensed to a company called Peloton Therapeutics that was later acquired by Merck. And the medicinal chemist at Peloton improved the drug-like properties of these chemicals. They made them more potent, they made them more specific, and they made them more bioavailable. And they shared with us an early version of this HIF2 inhibitor, which at the time was called PT2399. And our lab and the lab of my former postdoc, Jim Bergolis, showed that this first-generation HIF2 alpha inhibitor was highly active in what we thought were the best laboratory models of kidney cancers caused by VHL inactivation. But just to show you one example of an experiment from our paper, here what you're looking at are these little colonies of kidney cancer cells growing in soft agar. These are workhorse assays done in the field. And then we treated these cells with either 0.2 or 2 micromolar of this HIF2 inhibitor, and you now see that the foci, or these little colonies, are much smaller, and they're fewer in number. And so you want to go, eureka, high five, we've maybe cured kidney cancer. But I always warn students, the most dangerous result in science is the one you were hoping for, because that's when you get lazy and you just want to write the paper and you stop thinking, how can I be fooling myself here? And so my mantra is, the least interesting explanation for your data is the explanation until you do a better control and prove otherwise. So I'd like to believe this is all due to HIF2 inhibition. But what if I told you that at 10 micromolar or 20 micromolar, this chemical kills every cancer cell we've ever looked at, whether it expresses HIF2 or not? Could it be that this is simply an uninteresting toxin? Okay, maybe it does inhibit HIF2, but it's also an uninteresting toxin. And I point out this is the kind of experiment that gives cancer pharmacology a bad name, because I could do this with Clorox bleach. I could probably do this with a number of noxious things that we don't want to be giving to patients. So how can we convince ourselves that this is specific and it's on target? Well, you do a better control. So here the better control was to use a version of CRISPR to generate cells that had either wild-type HIF2 alpha or had HIF2 alpha with a single amino acid change in that pocket that would prevent the drug from entering the pocket but would otherwise leave HIF2 alpha intact. And now you see the cells don't care about this drug, so that showed you it was formally an on-target effect. So eventually, an improved version of this chemical came to be known as belzutifan with the brand name Welireg, and I should declare that I have a financial conflict of interest. And this drug has been approved for the treatment of advanced renal cell carcinoma, or kidney cancer. Now, a truism in medical oncology is that most cancer drugs work better in a frontline setting than in later lines of therapy. And so now we had this experiment of nature, because these von Hippel-Lindau disease patients develop so many tumors that they're often put in surveillance programs where they'll have an MRI every 3 to 4 months, and only if a tumor starts growing in a very suspicious or worrisome way will they undergo surgery, because otherwise they'd be going to surgery every few months. So we had the ability to take 61 patients with von Hippel-Lindau disease who had measurable kidney tumors that had not yet been treated in any way. So just as a comparison, on the left here are the data from patients with sporadic or non-hereditary kidney cancer treated with the HIF2 inhibitor, and each of these bars is an individual tumor from an individual patient. So if the bar goes above 0, the tumor kept growing despite the HIF2 inhibitor, but if it went below 0, the tumor shrank once the HIF2 inhibitor started. So you can see that some patients are having nice responses, but certainly not all the patients are responding. But I will point out, these patients were heavily pretreated. They had failed VEGF inhibitors. They had failed immune checkpoint inhibitors. They had often metastatic disease. But now if you look at kidney tumors in the setting of von Hippel-Lindau disease, where it's sort of a pseudo front-line type of experience, you can see that virtually all the tumors got smaller. Now, to be on the trial, you had to have a kidney tumor, but you could also have a hemangioblastoma of the central nervous system. Those tumors shrank. You could have a neuroendocrine tumor of your pancreas. Those tumors shrank. Now, I mentioned these patients were in surveillance programs for some period of time. So here in gray is the 4 years of surveillance for these 61 patients before they went on the HIF2 inhibitor in green. And every time you see a little geometrical symbol, that patient's going back to the operating room to have another tumor removed from their brain, their eye, spinal cord, kidney. And you could see once the HIF2 inhibitor started, the need for surgery decreased dramatically. And just to sort of put a human face on this, even before the results were made public, the patients on this trial were posting on their social media feeds that they were responding. And you can imagine, if you've seen this disease ravage your family generation after generation after generation, and by the way, some of these families in Europe can be mapped back to the 16th century, you just assume this disease was coming for you. But here's a patient saying, I never thought I'd see this day, and they're describing their tumors getting smaller, being stable, or in some cases disappearing altogether. And because everyone likes a vlog, and I am allowed to show this patient's face, here's a short video that was sent by another patient. We didn't test this, but however, so we're going to see if this works or not.
I just wanted to give you a quick update. I am in a gondola right now in Taiwan. Over there is Taipei 101. The gondola is actually right by the Taipei Zoo. But I just wanted to give you a quick update and say I'm doing well. I'm enjoying my trip. If it wasn't for the PT2977 drug trial, I would have never been able to come out here and do what I'm doing right now. So I just want to thank Peloton, and I hope Merck will fast track this drug for a VHL treatment. So if you guys are listening, hopefully you guys will put it on the market to help VHL. But yeah, keep watching these videos. I'll be making more, and I'll get better at it, and I have to get the angles right because I kind of look fat, you know?
That's when I know that person's back to health, right? That should be his biggest concern, is whether he looks fat on his vlog. And frankly, the FDA decided no more clinical trials were actually even defensible at this point, that the drug was so effective in the setting of von Hippel-Lindau disease. They approved the drug for the treatment of von Hippel-Lindau disease. Now, working on VHL also led to a broader interest in my lab in terms of how protein abundance is controlled in cells, because it is controlled very precisely. And so I want to switch to another story, and that's the story of thalidomide. Now, many of the students probably can't remember thalidomide, but I can remember when I was young seeing children who had been exposed to thalidomide in utero here, and these came to be known as the thalidomide babies. And in some countries, including in the United Kingdom and in Germany, this drug was available over the counter for the treatment of morning sickness and insomnia, which of course was ironic and tragic for these young children. But then through clinical serendipity, these drugs were found to be incredibly helpful for the treatment of multiple myeloma, which is a cancer of B cells. And so the question was, why is this drug so powerful for multiple myeloma, and how does it cause these limb defects? And our lab and my colleague Ben Ebert independently showed that these thalidomide-like drugs take another ubiquitin ligase now that uses the protein cereblon instead of the protein VHL. But once this so-called molecular glue binds to cereblon, it causes cereblon to now destroy two proteins we call IKZF1 and IKZF3, which turn out to be absolutely essential for multiple myeloma cells. Parenthetically, others showed that it also causes the destruction of a protein called SAL4, which is critical for limb formation. And as you would hope would happen, this has led to a lot of interest in developing new so-called degrader chemicals, degrader drugs, for proteins where we had high conviction it was a good target, but where chemists previously had no tool kit or tool available to turn them off. Now, in closing, part of the reason I showed the picture of me as a young doctor is I know it's difficult, but students, please try to remember that the faculty were simply you like 30 years ago, and we had some of your same questions and concerns. So hopefully we're a little bit wiser. You're certainly smarter and better looking, so maybe that kind of balances out. But I can guarantee you none of us had a straight line. All of us hit bumps in the road. All of us made mistakes. And so one of the reasons I was completely convinced I was going to be a doctor is I worked in a laboratory when I was in college on a project that was uninteresting, unimportant, and undoable in a completely dysfunctional lab with a completely absentee mentor. But I didn't know any better. I floundered for 18 months, and then he gave me a C-, which for a pre-medical student is like being told, you know, you have a good face for radio, I guess. And then, as an added flourish, he wrote in my transcript, Mr. Kalin appears to be a bright young man whose future lies outside the laboratory. And I share this with, I mean, I can laugh about it now. I can tell you I was not laughing at 22. I was not laughing at all at 22. Now, of course, it's kind of hysterical. But I share this because for the students, my hypothesis, and I'm in the hypothesis business, so my last hypothesis is that every single one of you at some point is going to encounter somebody who doesn't believe in you, puts you down, discourages you. Now, at that point, there are one of two things you can do. You can start believing them, but then unfortunately it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Or you can use that as a little extra motivational fuel to show them how wrong they were and make them look really silly. And I'm here to tell you, it just feels so much better to make them look really, really silly. And I debated whether to show the video, but I think I saw at least one student in the audience who looks like they're maybe in elementary school. So I will show the video clip, because I remember the first time I saw one of these video clips, I thought it was kind of cool. So we'll see if this works.
Professor William Kalin
With audio?
New York.
Oh, maybe not.
Is affiliated with Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston, Harvard Medical School in Boston, and Howard Hughes Medical Institute, Chevy Chase.
As Jim will attest, you practiced this for about an hour the morning of. You wouldn't think it would take an hour to get this part right, but it took an hour. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention, and to the students, you're the future.
Wow, what a moment. And this was only the beginning. So that you know, we'll have time for questions at the end of our four presentations, our four sessions. So write down what you want to ask to our guests, and then we will do that in the end, okay? So very proud to present our next speaker, Professor Pam Sharma. Professor Sharma was born in Guyana and moved to the US during her childhood. We talked about it yesterday. She earned her PhD in immunology and her medical degree from Pennsylvania State University. As a medical doctor, she completed her internal medicine residency at Cornell Medical Center and her oncology fellowship at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. She's a professor, a physician scientist at MD Anderson Cancer Center, and an international leader in cancer immunotherapy. Her pioneering work has been essentially in understanding the mechanisms of response and resistance to immune checkpoint therapies, contributing to the development of more effective treatments for cancer patients. Her key contributions include designing and leading the first ever neoadjuvant clinical trial utilizing immunotherapy and establishing the safety profile for treating early stage tumors. Professor Sharma, the stage is yours. Thank you very much.
But it's okay, perfect. Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak a little bit of my work today. Thank you to the organizers and to all of you for being here. I am going to talk a little bit about how we work between the clinic and the lab. As you heard, I'm a physician scientist, so I have an MD and I see patients in clinic 1 day a week. And I also have a PhD and I do a lot of research in immunology. So we're going to learn a little bit about the immune system and how immune checkpoint therapy revolutionized the field. And you'll hear later from Jim about the development of immune checkpoint therapy. So just to advance, these are my disclosures. But just to level set again, for those of you in the audience who may not know a lot about the immune system, as you're sitting here today, your immune system is doing a lot of work in your body. It's circulating, and it's making decisions about what belongs in your body and what does not. And the soldiers of the immune system that's making these decisions are really your T cells. So your T cells are really responsible for if you develop a bacterial infection or a viral infection to make sure that they get rid of those cells, but they do not harm your normal cells. And so they have to make these decisions constantly. And T cells are regulated very tightly. They need to be regulated so that they can do their job and then stop, so that they don't hurt you or create autoimmune diseases, but that they also recognize when it's time to do their job so that they get rid of infections or cancer cells. And the way in which they do this is really through multiple mechanisms, the first of which is the first signal, the T cell receptor. And T cell receptor will interact with MHC molecules and peptides, on your cells to make sure that that's a foreign peptide, not a self-peptide. So if it's foreign, it should go away, or if it's mutated, it should go away. But the T-cell receptor is sort of like the ignition on your on your car. It turns on the car, but it doesn't get the car moving. The gas pedal is what gets the car moving. And that's CD28, which is the other pathway you see here. So with the two, T-cell receptor and CD28 is how T-cells get going. But you can't keep the car going forever, otherwise you'll crash into things. So there's a brake pedal, and for the T cells, that's CTLA4 or other molecules you'll see later. And so CTLA4 is really the critical brake pedal to tell the T cells you need to stop, don't keep going, because you may cause autoimmune diseases. So Jim Allison's work really was the paradigm shift in cancer therapy by saying that instead of having the brake pedal come on during the time of cancer, we can stop the brake and allow the T cell to keep going for longer periods of time to allow for cancers to be eradicated. And so he developed an antibody against the CTLA4 molecule, and that then allowed T cells to have prolonged time to do their work. And during this prolonged time, they can allow for tumor rejection. And so then there are many drugs that can then target this inhibitory pathway. And the first of this was ipilimumab, or anti-CTLA4, which was approved in 2011 in the US and then across the world after that. But then there are other molecules too, such as the PD-1 and PD-L1, and I guess you'll hear more from Jim. But all of these are targeting your immune system. They're not targeting tumor cells. And because they target the immune system, they can treat many different types of cancers. They can treat melanoma, lung cancer, bladder cancer, kidney cancer, uterine cancer, gastroesophageal cancer, breast cancer. Many different types of cancers can be targeted. And so all of these have led to approvals in the US and again, across the world in different countries, different types of approvals have opened up in the field of immunotherapy. So although we have all of these different treatments now, we recognize that they're not always curing everyone. Some patients will respond and some patients will not. And we don't understand why all the time this is happening. So our research questions have always been, why do some patients respond and others? What are the biomarkers that we can use to predict the response? There are also toxicities associated with these drugs, and I won't have time to talk about that today, but I can answer questions later if you have them. And then are there biomarkers that we can select which patients should get these drugs, either as a monotherapy as just anti-CTLA4 alone, or possibly in combination, anti-CTLA4 plus anti-PD-1? And then what are the mechanisms that are different between anti-CTLA4 versus anti-PD-1, and when should anti-CTLA4 be used versus anti-PD-1? Are there other pathways that can be targeted to improve outcomes, and can we increase the number of patients who respond? So to try and answer some of these questions, as a physician, I'm able to design clinical trials and treat my patients. And so most of the clinical trials, as you may know, are phase 1 safety and dose escalation studies, or phase 2 efficacy, or phase 3 comparison to standard of care. What we implemented in my clinic was now these new clinical trials, these pre-surgical or tissue-based clinical trials in the neoadjuvant setting, meaning prior to a patient going to surgery, whereby we can obtain all of the tumor tissues at the time of surgery and then learn from the tumor tissues and the immune responses, what are the mechanisms that are leading to response, or what are the mechanisms that are leading to resistance to therapy, and also gaining clinical insight and understanding what is the biology that can drive this forward. We initiated these clinical trials in 2004, and the first trial was in 2006, and I highlight that for the students because, again, approvals of these drugs happen in 2011. But that does not mean that you don't have to just sit back and wait for approval. You can start to design the experiments where you want the questions answered in patients even earlier. So 5 years before any approvals of these drugs, we were already testing what happens in patients in terms of the biology of these agents. And so I highlight these studies again because you'll notice that these are small clinical trials, 10 to 20 patients usually. And most of the times, no one wants to design a 10 or 20 patient trial because it's not going to get you approval of a drug. But we design them not really for an approval, but really to understand, again, how the drug works in a human being, how the drug is manipulating the human immune response. And so in this first clinical trial, it was 12 patients in my own clinic that I was seeing these patients. These are 12 patients with bladder cancer. They're all scheduled to have surgery to remove their bladder because they have bladder cancer. But prior to the surgery, I asked them to participate in a clinical trial where they received 2 doses of anti-CTLA-4 antibody. And then at the time of surgery, I can take all of the surgical tissues back to the laboratory to then study what happens in the tumors and what happens with the patient's immune response in the tumors. So this trial allowed us to have a clinical signal for safety because we showed that we can give this therapy prior to surgery. But it also allowed us to have a clinical signal for efficacy since 3 of these patients, all their tumors went away. There was no cancer left. And this enabled us to say bladder cancer could respond to immunotherapy, and we designed larger trials with hundreds of patients that then led to the approvals of these drugs for patients with bladder cancer. We also did clinical trials in combination. So this is a clinical trial using anti-CTLA-4 and anti-PD-L1 combination. Again, in patients, small numbers of patients, where you can see 28 patients were treated, and then we were able to get access to all of the samples. By taking the samples from the patients back into the laboratory now, we can study what's happening in these tumor tissues that's leading to tumor rejection. And what you can see in this red bar is that what we identified were these things called tertiary lymphoid structures, or TLS. And what these consist of, as you can see in the picture, are multiple cells that are interacting together. B cells, T cells, dendritic cells, all of these cells are part of your immune system, and they're circulating in your body as you sit here. But when they interact, they allow for these cells to then be educated and learn from each other so that they can then lead to tumor rejection. And we found that when patients had higher numbers of these tertiary lymphoid structures, the red bar, then they had much better outcomes. And so one of the molecules that helped in driving the formation of these tertiary lymphoid structures, we think is related to this ICOS pathway. As you can see, it's a top gene that was identified in these studies. We went back to the laboratory because once you have patient data, it's correlative, and you can test the patient data back in the lab in models. And so in this mouse model, we used wild-type mice, or we use mice that have ICOS knockout or ICOS ligand knockout. So mice that lack the genes or mice that have all of them intact. And you can see in wild-type mice, when we give tumors and we treat with anti-CTLA-4, 80 to 90% of the mice have long-term survival, and they're able to reject the tumors. But mice that lack the ICOS or the ICOS ligand pathway are unable to clear the tumors as well, and they have impaired tumor rejection and anti-tumor immune responses. So then why is this ICOS-ICOS ligand interaction necessary? And as I mentioned, you need these cell-cell interactions to occur in order to get tumor rejection. So we formed the hypothesis that the ICOS-ICOS ligand drives the formation of these triads of CD4, CD8, and DCs. And again, these are very important critical immune cells for tumor rejection. I want to show you, and Jim is going to talk more about this in his talk, that in bladder cancer patients, we identified the formation of these structures as either triads or tetrads, as shown here. And in the patients who had these tetrads, they had much better outcome. But we showed that if you look at wild-type mice, you can see that they form a lot of these triads and tetrads. But in the mice that lack ICOS or ICOS ligand, as shown here, that tetrads or triads are no longer forming. So again, the ICOS-ICOS ligand pathway is important for the cell-cell interactions and the formation of these pathways. Now, what we were learning from these neoadjuvant clinical trials was that if you give immunotherapy prior to surgery, you can see the tumors going away, and maybe we can cure more patients this way. So we wondered again, can we give immunotherapy prior to surgery in patients who have stage 4 cancers? So these are patients who have cancers throughout their entire body. And normally you would not do surgery to just remove one lesion because that was done in the past. And if you remove one lesion but the rest of the body has cancer, the patients still go on to die from their cancer. So removing a single lesion has never been successful as a treatment. Once you have stage 4 disease, most people do not have surgery. But what I would like to propose that this was all done prior to the development of immunotherapy. And because with immunotherapy, when you give the drug, the drug affects your immune system. When you stop the drug, your immune system still lives with you. And your immune system stays with you throughout your entire life. And so by training your immune system about what cancer looks like, it is possible to think that throughout the entire period of your life now, that immune response and the memory that your immune system has will be able to eradicate the other tumors that may be there in stage 4 setting. So I want to show you that we did this prospective pilot clinical trial in patients with renal cell carcinoma, and you just heard about renal cell carcinoma from Bill Kalin's talk. But here we gave these patients either immune checkpoint therapy with surgery where we removed only one lesion. These patients have stage 4 disease. They have multiple tumors throughout their body. But we remove only one lesion, and then we give the patients continued immunotherapy. Or we did just a biopsy, so no surgery, just took a small biopsy, and the patients kept all of their tumors intact. And what we saw was that in the patients who had the immunotherapy plus surgery, you can see that the survival curve looks very different. And you can now see that these patients had 86% 2-year overall survival. Now, this trial was not designed for statistical comparison, but it led us now to the idea that you can think of surgery plus immunotherapy, even in patients who have widespread disease. And so now this is going to be tested in a new clinical trial. Importantly, we were collecting the samples from these patients, as I showed you, to understand what's driving this response in the tumor itself. And what we found, again, were these cell-cell interactions. So here you have non-responder patients who did not respond to the surgery plus immunotherapy, and responder patients. And what we found was that in the responder patients, there were these interactions between T cells, myeloid cells, and B cells. And again, this interaction allowed these cells to be educated in a way so that you can have tumor rejection. We then wanted to look at these cell-cell interactions that drive the immune response, and we did a pan-cancer analysis. So if you look here, we had 340 samples from 255 patients across 12 different cancer types. And I mean, we have cancer types like lung cancer, breast cancer, bladder cancer, colorectal cancer. And in all of these cancers now, we're asking within the tumors, how are these structures being formed? And what are the interactions that are allowing for tumor rejections? So this manuscript was just accepted, but I want to highlight the importance again of how you really quantitate these cells within the tumor microenvironment. So the question became, can immunotherapy drive the formation of these cell-cell interactions in so-called cold tumors? So as you know, tumors such as lung cancer, melanoma, bladder cancers, they respond to immunotherapy. But tumors such as pancreatic cancer or glioblastoma, for tumors of the brain, they do not respond as well to immunotherapy. And so we wondered whether in glioblastoma, in patients who have these brain tumors, can we get immunotherapy to form these cell-cell interactions so that we can get better outcomes. Most patients with glioblastoma die within 6 months to a year. And so if we could develop immunotherapy treatments for them the same way we did for melanoma, we could possibly have long-term outcomes. So we wanted to learn more about glioblastoma and the immune responses. And to do that, we went back to another clinical trial that was done in collaboration with the Breakthrough Cancer team, and this is the GBM team for Breakthrough Cancer, whereby now we take patients with glioblastoma and we inject into the tumor an oncolytic viral therapy that acts as an immunotherapy agent. And we do this 6 times into the patient's brain, and we collect tumor samples each time from the patient's brain so we can see how the immune response is evolving in the patient's brain over time. We can then do single-cell RNA sequencing, do trajectory analysis, look at cell-cell interactions, and try to understand whether or not there are different triads that are being formed with the immune cells. And so just to give you a snippet of this, what we do see in these patients, again, this is a human patient brain that we're looking at, and now we find that by giving this immunotherapy, you can start to see these cell-cell interactions. Here you see a CD4 T cells with a CD8 T cell and a dendritic cell working together, and this is known as a triad of these cells. However, what we found over time was that although we formed these triads that are the good cells that are educating them to allow for an immune response to lead to tumor rejection, over time, these triads that are in this orange-like color, you see it disappears over time, and there's a new triad formed in this light pink color. And this light pink color no longer have these dendritic cells as part of them, and they have something called plasma cells, which are part of your B cell components. And when you do this, you've lost the ability now to have a good immune response, and you have more of a suppressive immune response with regulatory T cells instead of effector T cells. And so this becomes the way in which you can now see the immune system is always trying to control itself. So even though you want to drive the immune system to lead to tumor rejection, the immune system tries to come back to homeostasis because it does not want to keep being turned on all the time. It has to have mechanisms that control it. And to control it are these regulatory mechanisms such as these plasma cells and regulatory T cells that interact. And so in glioblastoma, we may have to think of other ways to then target these regulatory pathways. Okay, so I just want to switch gears a little bit. I've talked about how the immune cells can impact response to immune checkpoint therapy, right? T cells, B cells, dendritic cells, all of these are immune cells, and they impact your response to immunotherapy. But what about your host genomic changes? Because you're all carrying around your own genetic code, your own genomic changes that can affect outcomes. And one of them that we studied is called clonal hematopoiesis. So I want everyone to, really think about clonal hematopoiesis as this age-related phenomena. As we age, there's a change in some of our blood cells, and there can be a single clone that can then have these somatic mutations in them. And again, you just learned about mutations from Bill Kalin's lecture, and so some of them are DNMT3A, TET2, ASXL1. These are just genes. And normally, these genes do not have any mutations, but in clonal hematopoiesis, they can have a single mutation in them. And even in healthy individuals, 10% of healthy individuals who are 65 or older carry these mutations. They mean nothing, and they do nothing. Okay, but when you get in patients who have cancer, 20% of these patients with solid tumors have these clonal hematopoietic changes. And we don't know how they affect the response to therapy. What we know is that clonal hematopoiesis can affect predominantly the myeloid cells, as you can see here. And since myeloid cells are an important part of the immune response, we were thinking that these myeloid cells can impact how immunotherapy responds. And so in a mouse model, we asked whether or not TET2 mutant macrophages or myeloid cells can improve immunotherapy responses. And in this model, you can see if you inject into the mice these TET2 mutant macrophages with immune checkpoint therapy into the tumors of mice, you see that now you get a much better outcome as a result of clonal hematopoiesis compared to the wild type. What we saw was that these TET2 polarized macrophages, these mutant macrophages, actually have the ability to present antigen better to the T cells and allowing these better cell-cell interactions between the T cells and the macrophages. And this allowed for a better antigen presentation score seen by the single-cell RNA sequencing analysis. We were then able to go back to patients. We looked at 35,000 non-small cell lung cancer patients and 25,000 colorectal cancer patients. And in these patients, we know the TET2 mutation status. And we asked whether or not in the setting of chemotherapy or frontline therapy, whether the TET2 mutation makes a difference. And you can see it doesn't. For frontline therapy, whether you have a TET2 mutation is not relevant. But in the setting of immunotherapy, if you have a TET2 mutation, you do much better in terms of your survival and your response to immunotherapy for both non-small cell lung cancer and colorectal cancer, indicating again that the genomic alterations play an important role in whether or not these patients will respond to immunotherapy. Okay, so I just want to, I know we talked about genomic changes and we talked about immunologic changes. I'm just going to give you a little bit of our work on epigenetic pathways. And again, epigenetic pathways control which genes are expressed and how these genes now can impact outcomes to immunotherapy. So as I mentioned, there are two signaling pathways: T-cell receptor, a signal 1, it's an ignition switch, and CD28, a signal 2, that's the gas pedal. And these two signals turn on the T cells. But remember, I told you the immune system is yin and yang. You cannot turn it on without it trying to control itself, right? You will push it in one direction, but it will try to come back to homeostasis. And so when these two signals tell the T cells you can turn on, there are other signals within the T cells to say turn off. CTLA4 is one of those signals, but another signal is EZH2. It increases in T cells, and it allows for stabilization of another gene called FOXP3. And FOXP3 is a transcription factor, as you heard about earlier. These transcription factors regulate other genes. And so this is another way for T cells to regulate itself. FOXP3 will create a suppressive mechanism so that the T cells can no longer reject tumors, they actually become more immunosuppressive, and the tumors can progress. So we know that this system exists, and we could show that in our patients who received anti-CTLA4, there was an increase in this EZH2 pathway in the T cells of patients who were not responding to therapy. And so we wanted to know, can we take this patient data back to the clinic, and back to the laboratory, and try to target the EZH2 pathway. So we had mice, these are the FOXP3 GFP mice, where you can sort these FOXP3 regulatory T cells by GFP expression. And then we can give an EZH2 inhibitor, and we can ask whether or not that changes these T cells. And when we looked by single-cell RNA sequencing, we can ask whether or not we change these cells phenotypically. And you can see we decrease the FOXP3 expression, and we increase all of the effector genes, CXCL10, granzyme B, and interferon gamma, that allows now for these T cells to be better at rejecting tumors. Functionally, we can show also, this is a CFSE dilution analysis, so as the dye gets more diluted, you can see now you have more proliferation. But when you have no EZH2 inhibitor on board, you can see now you're suppressing this pathway because regulatory T cells can suppress. But now when you add the EZH2 inhibitor, you block these regulatory T cells from working, and the effector T cells can proliferate, and you get dilution of the CFSE. So we asked whether or not we can use this EZH2 inhibitor in mouse models. And you can see when we gave the EZH2 inhibitor in combination with immunotherapy, you now see the mouse have the volume of tumor goes down, and the survival of the mice increase. This top line is the combination therapy here, showing improved survival as a result of these two together. So then we took the data from the laboratory back into the clinic, and I want you to remember this iterative process, right? We take the data from the patients, we go to the laboratory, we study the mechanisms, we take those mechanisms back from the laboratory into the clinic. So here we took this data that we saw in mice, that if you gave an EZH2 inhibitor in combination with immune checkpoint therapy, you get better outcomes. And we designed a new clinical trial whereby we can enroll patients. You can see again small numbers of patients, prostate cancer patients, bladder cancer patients, and renal cell carcinoma patients, 15 patients each, again to test the concept. It's a pilot study where we gave anti-CTLA4 and this EZH2 inhibitor. And again, we're collecting all of the samples from the tumors and the blood samples of the patients as we give the drugs so that we can understand the changes in the immune response for these patients. And what you can see in the single-cell RNA sequencing analysis, if you look at where the arrow is, there's this subset in the red dots where we now see that with giving this EZH2 inhibitor, we've now increased the effector T cell subset. These are the good T cells that are going to allow for tumor rejection. Not those regulatory T cells that suppress the response, but the good T cells that we want in our patients. So in this patient, you can see that you're increasing these effector T cells. And when you look at the patient's CAT scan, you can see now that this patient had these large tumors. And this was a patient who had multiple other therapies, but their tumors continued to grow. And now you can see that these tumors are shrinking as a result of this combination therapy. And so you can take this data again now to generate larger clinical trials, which is what we plan to do. So clearly, I'm going to say that immune checkpoint therapy has joined the ranks of surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy as a pillar of cancer treatment. Combination strategies are the future, but which combinations, and how are we going to study the biology so that we understand the appropriate combinations for the clinical trials in patients? I just talked to you about how we need to collect the patient samples and then look at it back and forth between the clinic and the lab. Clearly, distinct immune cell interactions occur intratumorally to drive the response to immune checkpoint therapy. So B cells interacting with dendritic cells, or B cells and T cells interacting, all of these interactions matter in terms of driving the response. There's a spatio-temporal evolution of immune cell interactions. You can see these dendritic cell triads becoming plasma cell triads in the GBM patients. And this can tell you that you can form an immune response initially that will lead to tumor rejection, but over time it may not be sustained, and you may lose the ability to have that response, and you may have to come in with another agent then to maybe target plasma cells in GBM. We showed you that host genomic alterations such as TET2 clonal hematopoiesis can affect immune cell subsets, and we can potentially select patients based on these clonal hematopoiesis changes to get the therapy. Epigenetic regulation of immune cell subsets is a feasible strategy for combination therapy. And I hope I've convinced you also that prospective randomized trials of debulking surgery, where you remove a single lesion in stage 4 cancer patients and still give immunotherapy, can lead to a good outcome. And that neoadjuvant and tissue-based clinical trials is a feasible platform for us to obtain approval of therapy in earlier disease setting, but more importantly, to obtain samples from patients so we can understand how these drugs are impacting our patients within the tumors and within the immune response. So this has always been a team effort, and this is all done at the Allison Institute, where we move very quickly between the clinic and the lab. We go back and forth between the two. And so physician scientists are really a bridge to enable this to happen between the scientists in the lab and the clinicians, to allow then for this collection of data back and forth. We have about 112 trials across 18 departments and have been studying thousands of samples. This is really a team effort between surgery, medical oncology, pathology, laboratory scientists, and computational biologists. It's an entire protocol that governs all of this work. There are many, many people that I have to thank. Their names are on the slides as I went through for all the students in the lab, but I especially would like to thank the patients who participate in our clinical trials and allow us to collect the samples so that we can study them. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sharma, for this fantastic talk, and also for devoting your life to help so many patients. Thank you very much. We will now have a break, coffee break. We'll be back in half an hour. You can use this moment to look at what our students are doing. They have posters outside, and we'll come back to resume at 4 o'clock. Thank you.
Hello. Hello. Bienvenidos de volta. Welcome back. I am thrilled to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Ronald DePino. Dr. DePino is a professor in the departments of cancer biology and genomic medicine at the MD Anderson Cancer Center, where he previously also served as president. A native of New York City, he received his medical degree from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Following his training, he started his lab there, then moved to the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute at Harvard in 1998, and following that, he moved to the MD Anderson Cancer Center, where he is today. Dr. DePino is a world-renowned researcher recognized for his groundbreaking discoveries in the studies of aging, telomeres, and cancer biology. He has received many accolades for his research, including election to the US National Academy of Sciences. Importantly, Dr. DePino was born to Portuguese parents, and he has a deep connection with Portugal. This background has inspired him to work to strengthen US-Portugal scientific interactions, including through the course that we are participating in now. So thank you very much, Ron, for your long-standing commitment to cancer research and to cancer research in Portugal. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It is obviously an honor for me to be here and to be in this session here with such esteemed colleagues. It is wonderful to have the students partake in this course and advance their careers. After all, you know, for those of us who've been doing this for a while, it's our most solemn responsibility. So we're just thrilled to have the opportunity to be able to do that. So today I'll be talking about our work on telomeres, which is really, these are my disclosures, by the way. I will be talking about some work that was recently licensed to the last company that you see there. I'll be talking about something that we've been very interested in, which is this intersection between aging and cancer. And what's really interesting from this perspective, it's the most important risk factor for the development of cancer. But interestingly, humans, as they age, they develop predominantly epithelial cancers. And those cancers arise with radically altered cytogenetic profiles. So more than 30 years ago, we were asking, well, why is it that we develop the cancers we do? And what is it about the genome that makes it so unstable in these cancers in particular? And what was very interesting to us, because we also studied cancer in the mouse, is that they develop a completely different tumor spectrum dominated by sarcomas, lymphomas. Epithelial cancers are exceedingly rare, and those cancers, when they arise, have a very benign cytogenetic profile, very little amplifications and deletions. And so we surmised that maybe the cross-species difference, if we could understand it, might illuminate why aged individuals develop the cancers they do and what is destabilizing the genome. And so what we did, we suspected that telomere biology could be a good candidate for this cross-species differences. Telomeres are the tips of your chromosomes. They help to maintain the integrity of the chromosome. If they're absent, the ends of chromosomes send out a DNA damage signal, and they also become subject to recombination. That is, you get end-to-end fusions of the chromosomes, and that obviously can wreak havoc and cause potentially chromosomal instability. At this point, not much was really known about what telomerase or telomeres did on the organismal level. All that was really known was more from cell culture-based studies. And as cells divide, if you don't have enough telomerase, which is the enzyme that synthesizes and maintains the telomeres, telomeres become shorter and shorter, and eventually they erode to a point where they then signal senescence or apoptosis or other DNA damage signaling responses. and you get cell cycle arrest or senescence, the so-called Hayflick limit. So that's what was known more or less about telomerase, telomere biology at the time that we started these experiments. And we thought that this would be a good candidate for the cross-species difference because in mice, the telomeres are very long. And so they don't experience this erosion and ultimate dysfunction of the telomeres. In contrast, humans have much shorter telomeres, less expression of telomerase. So those cells, as they divide, epithelial cells, for example, that turn over in life, that would lead to telomere attrition. Essentially, we walk this telomere plank into genomic instability and cancer. So we collaborated with Carol Greider, who won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of telomerase, along with Liz Blackburn, Jack Szostak. And essentially, there were two components that were really critical. The RNA component, which served as the template for the de novo addition of telomere repeats. And Carol had just cloned the RNA component in the mouse, and we collaborated in generating the first knockout. We also subsequently cloned the mouse telomerase reverse transcriptase gene, and we knocked out as well. And so those are two critical components, and when we knocked it out, indeed, those mice experienced a very interesting change in their tumor spectrum. So instead of just developing mesenchymal and hematopoietic malignancies, they essentially shifted their tumor spectrum to a human-like spectrum of breast cancer, colon cancer, and so on, so epithelial cancers. And also, for the first time, we saw that these genomes were now very unstable. We saw Robertsonian translocations. We saw for the first time amplifications and deletions. And that was important because when you generate these fusions, when you then have cell division and you break the chromosomes, you create a double-stranded break. And that break provides an opportunity for amplification of DNA or deletion of DNA at the break. So if you're doing this randomly throughout the genome and you're breaking these chromosomes, it provides an opportunity to potentially amplify an oncogene or delete a tumor suppressor gene, as Bill Kalin talked about. So essentially, one of the reasons why we develop the cancers we do is you have a lifetime of epithelial renewal. Your GI tract turns over every 7 to 10 days. That leads to telomere attrition. If you then deactivate DNA damage signaling so the cells can now survive and they divide, they don't undergo senescence or apoptosis, so usually you lose P53, which is a sensor of DNA damage or telomere erosion. You lose P53, and now you can have this fusion and breakage process that creates these breaks, amplifications and deletion, and you now initiate cancer development. Telomerase then comes on in those initiated cancers to enable full progression. So this was at least one mechanism by which telomere biology is able to contribute to carcinogenesis, the types of cancers we develop, and why the genomes are so unstable in those cancers. So you essentially need a mutator mechanism, either mismatch repair or some chromosomal instability mechanism to generate the large number of changes needed for epithelial carcinogenesis. But there are other important ways or other mechanisms that generate cancer as a function of advancing age. For example, Bob Schreiber taught us that diminished immune surveillance as we age is also a contributor to the development of cancer. So I'm going to tell you about aging and the immune system in a moment, but before that, I want to tell you about what aging is itself. And this is what I find very exciting about the aging field now, because up until relatively recently, this would be the definition of aging. Essentially, you accumulate damage in proteins and DNA, and your cellular decline occurs, and the wheels fall off, and you get more diseases. You don't function as well. So not very mechanistically oriented. But what's very exciting now is similar to the very first lecture that you heard in this course from Doug Hanahan. We have these hallmarks of cancer: mechanisms that drive the development of cancer, and the knowledge of the mechanisms allows us to develop therapeutic interventions squarely directed against those mechanisms. So the question is, are there mechanisms, hallmarks of aging, and can those in fact be drugged? Can they be modified to actually modify aging itself or age-related diseases such as cancer, Alzheimer's, etc.? And so that's what we now have. We now have a much better understanding of the molecular features that really drive the aging process, and some of them are listed here, such as genomic instability, so-called inflammaging or chronic inflammation, mitochondrial decline, cellular senescence, these zombie cells that accumulate in your tissues that cause local tissue damage, inflammatory cytokines, and then of course telomere attrition is a hallmark. But from our perspective, we began to think about the relationship of telomere biology to the rest of these, because we knew that when we had an eroded telomere, we can elicit cellular senescence. We also knew that telomere dysfunction is able to also affect mitochondrial biology. So on the right side there, you see that when you have DNA damage at the tips of the chromosomes, eroded telomeres, you activate p53. p53 can actually repress PGC, which are the master regulators for mitochondrial biology, mitochondrial biogenesis, mitochondrial function. They also regulate oxidative defense molecules. So here's another connection between telomere biology and another hallmark of aging. So we began to think about, well, how is it that telomere biology is connected or not to other hallmarks of aging? And we had a review in which we discussed this and show that there is direct connections between telomere biology and other hallmarks. So that then prompted us to do a series of experiments. And one of these experiments is to just ask a very simple question: what would happen if we were to generate a mouse that was prematurely aged because we now took away telomerase and they had eroded telomeres throughout the organism, and they had essentially organismal decline across all systems? What would happen in that context if we were to restore telomerase in all cells? Would we stop the aging process, slow it down, etc.? And more or less that's what we were expecting. To do that, what Mariella did here was to knock in the estrogen receptor moiety into the open reading frame of TERT to create a fusion protein that is inactive. So this is like the knockout. So the animal's prematurely aged. And if we give tamoxifen, we're able to restore and renature the protein, and now TERT, telomerase reverse transcriptase, can now act on the telomeres and resynthesize the telomeres. So we kind of expected that proliferative tissues, hematopoietic system, GI tract, skin, would be rejuvenated by reactivating telomerase. What we didn't expect is that not only did we see that, because you have to, by the way, go through S phase, through cell division, to synthesize telomeres, but we were seeing that both mitotic tissues and post-mitotic tissues were rejuvenated. So dilated cardiomyopathy normalized, neurons rejuvenated, and oligodendrocytes were also remyelinating the brain, etc. And so this was interesting because it taught us that actually aging is potentially a reversible or treatable process. And then subsequent to our work, about a half a dozen years later, some very important experiments emerged that further substantiated this point, which is that aging is a malleable system. It's biology. And if you understand biology, you can potentially control it. And so Belmonte and colleagues, for example, took the Yamanaka factors, which we all know generates essentially de-identified, dedifferentiated cells to pluripotency. But here what Belmonte did was to take those same factors and just transiently turn them on, and showed remarkable rejuvenating effects at the organismal level in mice. One of the issues with this technology, if you go a little bit too far, you get teratomas and cancer. So now one of the Yamanaka factors, the MYC, has been taken out, and there's less cancer, but it's still basically a concern. Because with these factors, you have the ability to potentially erase the identity of a cell, which you don't want. What you want to do is you want to restore it from being an aged state to a younger state. So we thought that TERT could potentially be one of these evolutionarily conserved cell state regulators by not only maintaining genomic integrity in the telomeres, but also potentially having some other function that allows it to maintain a particular cell state, that is a youthful state, and so on. So this is something that we were very interested in doing. And so then we tried to understand better, well, what could be this non-canonical function of TERT? And what we found in mass spec studies is that we're able to pull down components of the mediator complex in different cell types and different transcription factors in those cell types. So, for example, here in neurons, we're able to pull down beta-catenin, as you can see all the way there on the right. And the beta-catenin is the master regulator for neurons. In immune cells, we pull down NF-kappa B, skeletal muscle MyoD. So kind of master regulatory transcription factors for different cell types, but TERT is able to interact with the mediator complex of these transcription factor complexes, therefore having the ability to work across cell types as a single factor and influence the activity of those transcription factors. And those transcription factors in turn regulate genes that are central to the biology of those cells, such as neurons. Beta-catenin, as you may know, is the master regulator for all learning and memory genes, essentially, and NF-kappa B, of course, immune biology, etc. So basically, TERT is not only able to maintain telomeres, but it moonlights as a transcription cofactor. And you can chip them off many targets that are central to aging, per se, and age-related diseases. The other interesting observation that was made by Hong in the lab was that TERT is also epigenetically repressed at exactly the time that aging occurs, when it's the onset of aging. So that's about 50 years of age in a human, 18 months of age in a mouse. And so you see this is an accumulation of repressive marks in the older versus younger setting. And so we then asked, well, what would happen if we could develop a drug that could de-repress TERT and restore its normal physiological function seen in younger cells? And to do so, we generated a back transgenic that's 160 kilobases of the human TERT locus, and we put it into a mouse with a reporter embedded in it, and we showed that that back was able to recapitulate the temporal and spatial expression of the human TERT gene in human tissues. So we knew all the cis elements were there, and all the regulatory factors from the mouse could act on those cis elements. So we used cells from this mouse to screen close to 700,000 compounds in collaboration with Pete Schultz and Michael at the Scripps. And we identified a compound shown here, a series of compounds that were able to restore, and this is now in human fibroblasts, restore levels of TERT. We were able to show that the chromatin marks on the TERT locus were now open. So less H3K9 trimethylation, more H3K9 27 acetylation. We could show that we can restore telomere reserves. This happens to be in Werner's fibroblasts, which have very short telomeres. And it was highly cell penetrant. You might surmise that from the structure. And so it's easily able to get past the blood-brain barrier, skeletal muscle, heart, and so on. So with this molecule, we then tested mice that were quite old. Well, so we started at 22 months of age, which is the equivalent of a 70-year-old, treated them for 6 months, so now they're 28 months of age, which is the equivalent of a 90-year-old. And we looked at the hallmarks of aging and phenotypes. And one thing that we noticed looking at the hippocampus is that in the older mice, this is 28-month mice, we were able to see robust neurogenesis in the hippocampus, which is very important for working memory, and you need to create new neurons to maintain working memory. So this was encouraging that we actually were able to change or at least rejuvenate a very important memory center of the brain. And you could see the control animals, same age, with vehicle control with no neurogenesis. And then the other hallmark is senescence. So we used a variety of markers. I'm just showing you here SA beta cal and only spleen and kidney, but essentially the same thing. We alleviate senescence, and we know the mechanism for this because TERT sits directly on the DNMT3B promoter, upregulates its transcription, which methylates P16, which is an important senescence gene, a mortality gene that we actually knocked out about 30 years ago. And then the other thing that's important in aging is inflammaging, chronic inflammation in the tissues, throughout the whole body, inflammatory cytokines, etc. And what you can see here is you have alleviated microglial activation in the brain, neuroinflammation, and also if you look at key cytokines like IL-1 beta, IL-6, TNF-alpha, the master regulator, you see a restoration back to normal youthful levels of these cytokines. And then if you do transcriptomics, I'm only showing you here the hippocampus, you see long-term synaptic potentiation increase. So those are learning and memory genes, stem cell development, dopaminergic neurogenesis. The only thing that goes down are inflammatory cytokines. So this was encouraging because it suggested that we're sort of almost reprogramming or resetting the cellular and transcriptomic state of these cells across different tissues. So then, and also I won't show you the data, but we, in multiple different assay systems, Barnes maze, Y maze, novel recognition, we saw improved memory in these aged mice. So essentially what we have is we have a molecule that can de-repress TERT. This then allows it to act on telomeres and maintain telomeres, important for proliferative tissues, but also regulate gene expression in all these different cells. This impacts multiple hallmarks of aging listed here, and it impacts things on the organismal level as well. And so you see improved cognition, improved grip strength, the skeletal muscles improved, etc. We actually have Alzheimer's models. We have a very significant impact on the trajectory of that disease, both in mouse models and in IPS human disease models, etc. So this was encouraging. And so getting back to cancer now, I told you that one of the things that telomere biology does is to destabilize the genome. So that's important, obviously, for cancer pathogenesis, but we're also very interested in trying to understand whether or not it may also impact immune senescence, which is critically important for immune surveillance, vaccine responses, et cetera, are obviously impaired in the aged. So this could be a very important contributor as well to cancer. So let me tell you a little bit about the aging hematopoietic system, and Pam really touched on this. So what happens on the right there is that you decline your HSCs, you have what's called myeloid bias, so you make more myeloid cells at the expense of T cells, erythrocytes. In fact, you have a very significant decrease in naive T cells as you age, which are critically important. You'll hear about that in the next talk. And then you have clonal hematopoiesis. These are hallmark features of an aging hematopoietic system. And you could see, as beyond the ages of 50 and 60, you have the accumulation of senescent markers like KLRG1. You have a decline in naive T cells over the age of 60, et cetera. So these are major hallmark features of an aging hematopoietic system. Now, one of the other things that's really known about in the clinic, that is if your donor is over the age of 50, your survival is much worse. As opposed to a young donor, the recipient will do much better. So we did a very simple experiment. Could we rejuvenate the human hematopoietic system in vivo in a mouse? So we did that both ex vivo and in vivo. And essentially what we did is we took individuals, donors that were over the age of 60, took their HSPCs, did ex vivo work as well as in vivo work. I won't tell you about the ex vivo work in the interest of time. But similar to humans, if you look at the transplanted mice with the vehicle, they don't really take. They do have CD45 positive cells, But with TAC, you can readily see now that we have a statistically significant increase in the take of these cells. But what's particularly interesting is that if you look at, we did single cell analysis and looked at all the different compartments, showing you here just the long-term HSCs here, you could see on the left, in terms of what goes up, are genes that control T lymphocyte development, control erythrocyte development. Remember that myeloid bias. You get less of those cells. Now you have these master regulators being upregulated, and the ones that are downregulated on the right side are the things that create myeloid cells, so myeloid differentiation. And then all of the other that's going down, those are all linked to inflammation, as STAT and so on. And so that was the transcriptomic data. And then very interestingly, when we audited the different lineages, in the hematopoietic system, we essentially alleviated myeloid bias. So what we see is inflammatory monocytes, the ones that Pam talked about, those go down. And what increases are the T lymphocytes predominantly. And naive T cells are restored, and the senescent markers are eliminated. So that was a human in vivo system that gives us encouragement that this could also be applicable to the human setting. So I'm now going to tell you in the last few minutes just a little bit about some cancer relevant studies. So here what we did is we took a very old mouse, 24 months of age. We treated with TAC. We implanted it with an immunogenic cell line, a colon cancer cell line that has lots of neoantigens, and then just looked at the tumor infiltrating lymphocytes. And essentially what we found, we were able to restore TAC to normal levels found in youth, but we can now have more cycling T cells in CD8s in the tumor. We see less exhaustion of those cells, so less PD-1, and we're able to have also less senescent markers. So the KLRG1 senescent markers went down. So that was encouraging that we were somehow changing the phenotype of these tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes. So then we did a couple of experiments to look at this at the functional level. So here again, pre-treatment with TAC. Now using a cancer vaccine, OVA, and cells, MC38 cells that were pulsed with OVA, and then look at endpoint. Now when you do this in a young animal, they all respond. They all eradicate the tumors in this setting. So this is a very immunogenic cell line. You do these vaccine responses, they eliminate. And so essentially, those first two bars there, the red, are just vehicle control. That is no immunization implanted with MC38, the OVA, but no response. Then the second one are the old animals that did not receive TAC. You see essentially all of the animals succumb, they all develop tumors. But in the third column are the ones that essentially eradicated the tumor, and we had two animals that had 1 millimeter lesions. So essentially restored these cancer vaccine responses in the context of a very aged animal. And then finally, I'll tell you about one to just introduce. I'm the warm-up band for Jim Allison, basically. So this is just an experiment to really emphasize just how important his work is. So here we have very old animals, again, 24 months of age, and young animals, 3 months of age. And in this particular experiment, what we simply did was to pre-treat with TAC in the setting, injected them again with MC38, and just did 3 doses of anti-PD-1 just to look at checkpoint blockade. And it's known in humans, especially lung cancer, for example, if you're over the age of 75, the hazard ratios of your response to ICI, which tracks with the amount of naive T cells, is very, very different than those that are much younger. So again, reflective of an aging immune system. So this was the experiment, and essentially what we found was that, and I'm just going to go through this quickly, it alleviates the senescent markers. We see that this is now TAC, PD-1, and TAC plus PD-1. We see that PD-1 goes down quite well in both, a little bit more when you add TAC, but the quality of those T cells is improved. So we see that those CD8s now make much more perforant if we add PD-1 along with TAC, and also granzyme, you could see, is much better, more highly expressed. So the quality of the T cells is also improved in this setting. But this now correlates with very interesting responses. I won't go through this data, but the rest of the immune system also changes in a favorable anti-tumor pattern. Essentially, what we now do here, again, TAC, implant the tumors, then treat with PD-1. And essentially, what you could see here in the young animals is that TAC doesn't do much. So those two bottom lines in terms of growth, tumor growth, is PD-1 or TAC plus PD-1. And you could see in the Kaplan-Meier curves, the top line is TAC plus PD-1. So maybe it's a touch better than PD-1, but not statistically significant. However, if we look in the aged animals, similar to humans, the tumors grow in the aged animals. So again, these are 24-month-old animals. So PD-1 tumors grow, but TAC plus PD-1 are better controlled. And if you look at the survival curves, essentially the responsiveness to anti-PD-1 is now restored back to what you see in the young animals, suggesting that we are able to rejuvenate immune responses, rejuvenate checkpoint blockade activity. Okay, so that's my story today. So we have a better understanding of aging in the field now. We have cellular and molecular mechanisms. We can then begin to think about how those mechanisms are regulated. We believe that TERT is an apex regulator, whether there are others as well, we of course don't know yet. But this is one that doesn't, like the Yamanaka factors, really lead to de-differentiation. This is really changing cell state. So if you look at aging cell state versus youthful cell state, what we're doing is we're bringing it back and we're preserving the identity of those cells. And that aging is something that can be manipulated, treated, and that it does impact on age-related disease. I showed you cancer, but we have data from other age-related diseases as well. And we think that this is very important because, of course, with the changing demographics, we now have 1.2 billion people over the age of 60. After 60, every 5 years, you have a doubling of cancer, diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's. So this is a significant issue. So there's a lot of years spent with those diseases that cause a lot of pain and suffering and have a very significant economic toll. And if we could just delay those 4 diseases that I mentioned by 1 year for a generation over a 25-year period, the savings just to the United States healthcare system alone over a 25-year period would be $32 to $38 trillion. And that's just a 1-year delay. So aging, which is, I would call it the emperor of all diseases, if we could really think about how to target aging, intercept aging, then we could potentially impact on age-related diseases such as cancer. And so with that, I'll end and thank the people that did the work. So Hong did all the TERT activating compound work. Han Woon did the very first knockout in collaboration with Carol Greider and Maria Blasco. Thankful to Pete Schultz and Michael Bolong for helping us do the screen, and of course, our supporters. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado.
Well, thank you very much, Professor De Pino, for this very inspiring talk. So we're going to go now for the last intervention of the day. And our next and final speaker is Professor James P. Allison. So James Allison is a widely acclaimed immunologist and professor at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Texas. He was born in Texas and received his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. James Allison's career spanned several prestigious research institutions that include UC Berkeley in California and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York, where he was the head at the Ludwig Center for Cancer Immunotherapy. Professor Allison had an idea that revolutionized the world of oncology, and that was to unleash the body's own immune system to fight tumors. His groundbreaking contributions led him to be awarded the 2008 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, together with Dr. Tasuku Honjo, for the development of immune checkpoint blockade therapy, a revolution in cancer treatment that has transformed the prognosis of thousands of patients worldwide. Please join me on stage, Professor Allison. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I really want to thank you and Ron and all the others for giving me a chance to come here and see Portugal a little bit more than I did the last time, which was just going back home from a cruise, but also having a chance to meet all the young scientists who are here with all the wonderful ideas and enthusiasm. And I just want to tell you guys, just keep it up. And I hope this has been useful to you guys. I've certainly learned a lot from talking with you. Some of this you're going to see again, one figure probably for the fourth time today. But what I want to do is give you an overview of checkpoint blockade. But more importantly, I want to give you a really mechanistic understanding of the differences between the two checkpoints that are in use today, and some understanding of why they work so well. In the process of doing this, we've uncovered some new biology that we were really surprised at. Actually, observation was really first made by Pam Sharma. She mentioned earlier, those are my disclosures. None of them are relevant to this. So why immunotherapy? The reason I got into this was a lot of deaths in my family when I was young, and I decided I had seen the effects of chemo and radiation, and I wanted to do something about that. And I just thought that, it was too harsh, and there had to be a better way. I started in college as biochemist, thinking that was a good way to do it, develop drugs to have cancer. But then I heard about T cells, and they'd just been discovered, really. I'm talking about now, we're going back to the 70s, the mid-70s, and T cells weren't very understood. The signals that turned them on, the antigen receptor was not known. The professor that I heard about them from said he didn't even believe they existed. He thought they were just macrophages that had picked up an antibody on their surface because they were too mysterious. They percolate through your body and look for virus-infected cells, or I thought potentially cancer cells. So for young people, I knew nothing about it, but also the field didn't seem to know anything about it. So I said, that's where I'm going to work, because one thing, it's important. The second thing is everything I do is going to be new. And because none of that stuff was really understood. But the other reason I wanted to do it is because it really made a lot of sense. As well known, you've heard in this meeting, the understanding of the causation of cancer really came from the Human Genome Project and sequencing, identification of oncogenes and all that you're aware of. But what became apparent, I think, is that you could identify the oncogenes, you could design the perfect drugs that target BRAF, for example, and you can kill 99.9% of the cells, and it looks like the patient gets better and everything, except it comes back, and it just has another driver mutation or a bypass of that. And so targeting any single mutation is going to be temporarily useful, but not curative, probably. And because of just the genomic instability and the things that you've heard about. And it seemed to me that immunotherapy offered the specificity of T cells to recognize peptides, including mutated peptides. So they don't recognize any particular peptide. The T cells don't care if the peptide's derived from a driver mutation or from what they used to call passenger mutations. And I used to talk to Harold Varmus about this. He just considered them all junk. Just don't pay any attention to those because they don't drive it. And we had a discussion once, and I did a calculation from the mutations and said, and from some of the early genomic sequences, said, well, by looking at what bindings to HLA, there's 40 targets for T cells in every hepatocellular carcinoma cell. And so, that's a lot more than the one that you get from the oncogene. And I thought this is really what to do. So the immune system, the point I'm trying to make is the immune system doesn't target any particular product. It targets the process of carcinogenesis, of mutagenesis itself, regardless of where the mutations land. There are rules that control that, but they're not important. Second thing is, of course, once you've got the T cells, you've got them hopefully for the rest of your life, because I'll show you later there are stem cell factors that come up in a certain fraction of activated T cells so that they just perpetuate. If the tumor comes back, they can go cease their dormancy, start dividing, and come back and attack the cancer. And it's also adaptable because if the tumor has a new driver mutation, a new set of mutations generated by genomic instability, the immune system can detect that too, and triggered properly can take out the cancer at that point. So all of those things, the way of saying the immune system is a match for cancer, theoretically. And so anyway, but as I said, the rules weren't understood. And so this slide actually shows about 15 years work from our laboratory. First, people had known what the T cell receptor was. We published the structure of it in proteins in '81, and then of course Mark Davis attacked Matt cloned the genes a couple of years later. But we very quickly realized that wasn't sufficient. You needed this second signal from CD28 together, then you turn on all these things that drive the cell towards division, turn off anti-apoptotic factors, and the cells start dividing. They make IL-2, they start dividing. But that also, when you activate that program, you also turn on the CTLA-4 gene. It comes up, as you heard before, outcompetes, from Bruno, it outcompetes CD28 for binding. It's the mutual ligands, B7 molecules, that it has with B7, and turns the T cells off. And this is a hardwired program in every T cell response you get. The T cells, as I said, you got 10 to the 10th total T cells, only a few hundred to anything. So expand the fraction that can expand, do what you need done, and then they stop, and it's CTLA-4 that comes up, it keeps them from dividing, and ultimately the immune response grinds to a stop. These molecules, I just want to show this because the cell biology of these guys is really cool. This one on the left is a GFP fusion that we made in the late 80s, that's showing CD28 is all over a cell, and when it contacts an APC, it concentrates at the synapse and helps the TCR signal. So that's how it works. It gives the two signals together then give a very strong signal that turns the T cell on. CTLA-4 is a sneaky little thing. After it's made, it hides in vesicles in the back of the cell, as shown here. And when the T cell contacts a target, those vesicles are pulled to the front of the cell as the cytoskeleton rearranges to the area right below where CD28 is. These fuse with the membrane and spray CTLA-4 right into the synapse so that it very efficiently disrupts the structures that have formed there from CD28 B7 interaction. So that red spot is what it works. If I threw a CTLA-4 antibody in there, you wouldn't see that red spot. It wouldn't move. Nothing would happen. So anyway, what does this have to do with tumors? Well, tumors were thought to not have any antigens. That was an idea when we started this work, that they were waiting for the oncogene to come along and maybe there'd be some antigens then. But we took a bunch of mouse tumors that grew very readily in mice and put B7 into them, the ligand for CD28. That's all, and so all we had to do is just put that molecule into them. We could get every mouse tumor that anybody had ever worked with rejected almost immediately from mice. That was all they had. They had tons of tumor antigens in them that could be recognized, but they didn't have the ability to give that CD28 signal and start an immune response. And so I got to think about this. So, well, what happens then is the tumors go around, it gets a head start, they're invisible even though they've got antigens and all that stuff's going on. But then if the tumor gets big, dies, causes inflammation, the innate immune system comes in, the dendritic cells in particular come in, pick up the tumor debris, reproduce it on their surface, as shown on the left panel here, then that turns on, then you get both signals to the T cell, starts going, but that also turns on CTLA-4 and it stops them. And so I thought, this is really simple. All we need to do is take the brakes off and let the T cells keep going for a time. they could kill all the tumors, and then we stop giving antibody, it gets cleared, everything comes back to normal. So that was the idea, but does it work? Anyway, I'll just show this one experiment. We did this in almost any transplantable tumor line you can think of, and any mouse strain that you can think of. And very often this was the thing. If we blocked CD28, the tumors grew faster, as you can see here. But if you inject anti-CTLA-4, the tumors would continue to grow for a while, but then would be rejected. And those mice you could challenge with 100 times as much tumor as you gave them the first time, and they'd just reject it. So they were totally immune to that tumor after that. Some tumor models, CTLA-4 blockade by itself didn't work. We had to add a vaccine, and we had to add a little chemo, we had a little radiation, or we did all kinds of things. And we could get essentially every tumor model, transplantable tumor model, we could cure those in mice. It took a long time to convince anybody that this would work. There's a movie out about this if anybody wants to see it, but the interval between that slide and this slide. But we succeeded in making a monoclonal antibody to a human antibody to CTLA-4. Human CTLA-4 in mice that had their antibody genes replaced with human antibody genes, so it was a human antibody right away. And I show this photograph. This was the first patient that I ever met. It's while I was at Sloan Kettering, a patient of Jed Walchuk's, Sharon Belbin. When she was 22 years old or so, she was an athlete. She had trouble breathing and went to her family doctor. He diagnosed her with metastatic melanoma. She had 2 cutaneous lesions, 31 lung lesions. Her liver was full of tumor. She had a 1.5 centimeter brain tumor. She failed chemo, failed radiation, and Jed said, the only thing we've got is this drug, ipilimumab, as it was called. And actually, at that time, it was called MDX-010, I think. But anyway, so we got this drug, and she was hospice bound, at 23 years old. Just ridiculous, about to start her life, and said, you're going to hospice. He gave her the antibodies. She went away for a few months, came back, and was feeling better. They did the scans, and there was no tumor detectable anywhere. The radiologist got very confused and thought at first the films had been confused, and they had to do all this checking and double checking and rescanner and everything, but all the tumors were gone. That was in 2005. This is a photograph of her in 2016 with her 2 children. That's a picture of her she went to Stockholm. I invited her to go to Stockholm with us. That's us in the Grand Hotel in Stockholm having a cocktail before the ceremony. Anyway, she's still a very good friend. I don't know if I should add this or not, but she got divorced several years back and asked me if I would come and do her wedding. So I got a divinity degree from the internet and conducted the marriage ceremony. So I also married her, and we're still good friends now, but that was 22 years ago now, 21, 22 years ago, and she hadn't had any sign of disease, no need for retreatment or anything. A true remarkable finding. Taught me a lot about what it means to get over this. And of course, at the time, the trial that Jed was doing read out, there was 20% survival. It looked like 20% or so of the patients were cured. But why wasn't it all of them? Well, I could give you some mechanistic arguments why it might be, but one obvious one was maybe there are additional checkpoints that come into play and stop it, even though we're taking off this one that occurs during priming, during the initial priming of a T cell. And sure enough, PD-1 is a molecule that Tosco Hanjo had discovered many years ago, were shown by Arlene Sharp and Gordon Freeman at the Dana-Farber, really to have another ligand and was another checkpoint. So the PD-1 molecule is showed here. This is not a particularly good slide, but it's expressed on mature cells that are trying to kill a tumor cell that are making gamma interferon. The tumor cell responds to it by upregulating PD-1 ligand, which then turns the T cell off functionally. And so it happens at the very end and only works on functionally differentiated T cells. And that's why when you put them together, as you'll see, it works so well. Anyway, this is a trial. This is the first 10 years of a trial of CTLA-4 by itself, PD-1 by itself, and then the combination, with more than half of the patients being alive 10 years after the initial treatment. And but one of the points that came out of this trial was after 3 years, nobody died of melanoma. The people that died of heart attacks or old age or car wrecks or whatever. There's been a 5-year now follow-up, and it's still the same. So the curve looks exactly the same. Flat survival curve for 15 years in melanoma. There have been some neoadjuvant studies inspired by some of Pam's studies that show a survival rate of over 70% now and shorter 3 or 4 year survival times. But anyway, with PD-1 and CTLA-4 put together, there have been 80 plus approvals over the years in many, many different kinds of cancers. As Pam mentioned, the thing to remember is this is not a cancer drug. This is an immune system drug. So at least to the first approximation, the kind of cancer doesn't really matter. Although things do matter, like frequency of mutations and all that. Anyway, there have been millions of people treated by now. Right now, about 45% of people diagnosed with any kind of cancer are eligible to get one or the other of these checkpoints. It's estimated that more than 0.5 million, I've seen estimates as high as 1 million people now worldwide are in 5-year or longer remissions from cancer that have been induced by these. So it's becoming really widespread. But as Pam said, it's important to know when it works and why it doesn't. So we've been, for the last several years, have been studying the mechanisms that underlies CTLA-4 and PD-1 blockade and why they really do work so well. Well, this just summarizes some of the main points. CTLA-4 is hardwired. It's a part of the immune response to everything. You get the expansion phase, they do their job, but then they go away. And this is what makes them go away. When you knock it out, a mouse fills up. As you heard earlier from Bruno, the mouse just dies because it fills up with T cells that can't stop dividing, that are probably reacting with self-antigens. Anyway, PD-1, as I showed you, is an induced resistance. The tumor is responding to the immune onslaught and defending itself. This is also thought to play a role in protecting the developing fetus from attack by maternal T cells looking for paternally encoded antigens. So the tumors may have just co-opted it. I'm not sure. CTLA-4 targets the CD28 co-stimulatory pathway, PD-1, the antigen receptor pathway. CTLA-4 blockade works during priming, PD-1 on fully differentiated functional T cells. CTLA-4, as we showed in the early 90s, using a set of graded peptides of different affinities for TCRs, it drops the avidity that you need to trigger a T cell. So it pulls into the immune response clones that may have been too weakly reactive to do anything until you give CTLA-4, and then it drops the threshold and they can include. So it broadens the diversity of immune response, whereas PD-1 doesn't. It just expands the T cells that you already expanded earlier. CTLA-4, as I'll show you, primarily affects CD4 T cells. PD-1 as monotherapy only affects CD8s. It doesn't touch CD4s, from what we can tell. CTLA-4, as Pam showed you this morning, at least in prostate and bladder cancer, can move T cells into otherwise cold tumors. PD-1 doesn't do that in exactly the same tumors unless they're highly inflamed. PD-1 doesn't work in those cancers. But the adverse events, probably because of all the stuff above, with CTLA-4 are relatively frequent, although they're essentially the same as PD-1, but with PD-1 they're much less frequent. The disease recurrence after CTLA-4 responses are really rare, but PD-1, they're significant, 25 to 35% at about 2 years, although after that, people are probably pretty well. As I'll show you, one of the key things about CTLA-4 is that it expands CD8 T cells that have a stem cell factor called TCF7 that's responsible for self-renewal. PD-1 does not do that. It expands the terminally differentiated CD8 functional cells that express the factor TOX instead of TCF7. I'll get back to the details of that in a minute. And finally, as I'll show you later, the CTLA-4 treatment can remodel the myeloid populations, and so especially when you stimulate ICOS, as you heard from Pam earlier. But PD-1 doesn't do that. It just expands the T cells. It really doesn't seem to do much to myeloid cells. So one of the first things we did to figure out the differences when CyTOF came along, we could do high parameter flow cytometry. I think everybody understands it now, so I'm not going to go into it, except we measured everything we could measure on T cells and correlated them to the size of the tumor in the mouse that we were measuring. So we knew which were associated with tumors getting bigger or tumors getting smaller. Anyway, I'll spare you all the data, but just to show you the bottom line, if you look at exhausted CD8s, these are T cells that have high PD-1, CD8 cells have high PD-1, LAG3, TIM3. Epigenetically, they're frozen in that tox state, and PD-1 expands those. It doesn't change their phenotype. So when the antibody goes away, those cells stop dividing. So that's why you have to keep giving PD-1. For those of you who work in the clinic, PD-1 is given for as long as 2 years, whereas CTLA-4 is never given for more than just a couple of injections. Also, these exhausted cells, which either in the blue dots here, which are just showing either isotype control or PD-1 monotherapy, where the number of the cells correlates with smaller tumor size. After you add CTLA-4, not only does the number of exhausted cells go down, but the ones that remain become completely irrelevant to the tumor rejection response. So you really right away, when you add CTLA-4, you take away the main cells that PD-1 works on. They're not there anymore. And why they're not remains a mystery. I'll try to shed some light on that in a moment. But if you look at CD8s, which are expanded by CTLA-4, not all that much by PD-1, but if you put them together, if you add CTLA-4 and PD-1, those effector cells, which are not, they don't have the three high levels of inhibitory molecules on their surface. They also are not fully into that tox-only TCF- state. You get these effector cells, which are much better at killing. And if you look at CD4s, they're expanded with CTLA-4, although there's something underlying this that I'll get back to later. PD-1 doesn't do much to them, but when you add PD-1, it expands those CD4s that have been previously expanded by CTLA-4 because they're activated and they express PD-1 as well, so you hit them too. So you start with a thing where PD-1 works on exhausted cells, primarily to a situation where you add CTLA-4 and it works on, you get effector T cells and effector CD8s are the ones that are coming out. So you've got fully armed populations, both types of T cells. That just summarizes what I've said. And Pam talked to you about ICOS cells when we first started sharing data when she had moved to Sloan Kettering, and I was still when she had moved to MD Anderson, I was still at Sloan Kettering. She told me about finding these cells, and I was really mystified by them. And so I'll just go through, and most of this is her work. But she found these cells in her bladder cancer trial where she had tissue. She found that there were these ICOS positive CD4 cells that went up. She first talked about that then. She shared that information with Jed Walchuk at Sloan Kettering, who looked at patients in the phase 3 trial in the blood and showed that the patients that responded all had elevations of at least 2 to 3-fold of CD4 cells that expressed ICOS. And if they didn't, and they had to stay there for the whole period of therapy, if the patients didn't have that, they did not respond at all. All the patients that had the cells didn't respond. What I'm saying is if you didn't get those, you were not going to respond. No patients responded that had them. So it's a pharmacodynamic marker that ipilimumab's hit its target and you're getting changes, not necessarily marking who's going to respond. But as she also showed you, it's required in a earlier slide, it's required for optimal activity of anti-CTLA-4. If you knock it out, you lose about 50% of the effectiveness of anti-CTLA-4. But one of the things that we found when CyTOF came along and other techniques, and we could add a few more markers, we could not find those ICOS positive CD4 cells in untreated patients. It wasn't that we were increasing the number. We thought that before because we weren't really differentiating well from ICOS positive from other ones. But when we marked it with ICOS plus the transcription factor Tibet, because Pam showed these cells were making gamma interferon. We could not find those cells in untreated patients. When we looked in mice, we could find them if they were treated with anti-CTLA-4. We could not find them in the blood or the spleens or the thymus or anywhere. We could not find those cells in mice unless they were treated with anti-CTLA-4. So something, is up there. Where are they coming from? And so what we did was go back to the knockouts that we had been studying for a while, but now we had really much better techniques in the earlier days. And this on the left shows these are Tisney plots. The blue is heterozygotes, green the wild type, and red are the CTLA-4 knockouts. And you can see that whole Australia-looking thing down there. Those are weird cells. You don't find them in normal lymphoid tissues, just like people. You don't find them anywhere. They're down there, kangaroos jumping around, weird stuff going on. So if you really look in there and annotate what's in there, well, these are the cells. This is the same cell that's expanded by anti-CTLA-4. It's in this constellation here. Those are the cells. You can see they're not detectable at the level of 0.5%. I would say was our margin here. But they go up to 5% or so, the total cells in the CTLA-4 knockouts. There are also these other ones. This is one of the most interesting ones for the immunologist here. You'll think that this is really a freak because it's got BCL6. It ought to be a follicular T helper cell. Or GATA3, it ought to be a type 2 Th2 cell making type 2 cytokines. Neither of those would do you any good in a tumor. ROR gamma T are cells that are causing inflammations. They make IL-17 and other toxic stuff. They're making all of those. And I mean, when we isolated those cells, they're making all those cytokines. And so where are these coming from? Then there's two others I'm not going to go into, but you see these new phenotypes coming out in the absence of CTLA-4. Why is that? Well, that's because when a T cell, a CD4 T cell comes out of the thymus, it's got CD4, it's got a class 2 restricted TCR, but its function is completely unknown. That's acquired. A CD4 cell's function is acquired the first time it sees antigen. And it depends on the signal strength. That was shown by Kim Bottomley in the 70s. It depends on the cytokines that are around. It depends on a lot of stuff. And we think that what's going on is that CTLA-4 is always there. It's always present when a T cell's responding. So it's inhibiting that strength of the TCR CD28 combined signaling. It can never reach full strength because you're holding it back. And so the other possibilities are that there's something going on in the thymus, but we look, nothing going on there. Enhanced proliferation or activation, no, we didn't see that on particular difference in those cells. So we think it's deregulation of phenotypic constraints that limit the possibilities for T cells. So we're dealing with cells that are just outside. They're the supernormal, or supernatural, if you will, T cells that come out because they don't come out in the normal level of signaling. And the concept for immunologists or non-immunologists, all this is, the immunologist has been taught for years. These are linear things, digital, binary decisions made by T cells. And they end up matching a transcription factor with the cytokines they make. But we think our data supports that it's not that simple. They go through intermediate stages where they express multiple ones, and after selection, depending on what's going on, they end up with a univalent sort of function, so a more nuanced expression. Anyway, Pam's already showed you that. So one of the things we wanted to find out, though, is if we gave a signal through ICOS, could we make immune responses stronger? And so this uses a tumor cell vaccine that we put ICOS ligand in. And this shows a not very responsive tumor that's given CTLA-4 plus just a vaccine without ICOS ligand. And this one is the same, except it's got ICOS ligand. So you go from 20% efficacy to 90% efficacy. And if you do that in ICOS knockout mice, it doesn't work. So you have to have signaling through ICOS. This is what Bill referred to and said there's ICOS antibodies been tested. They blew it because this biology is incontrovertible. We're still working on it. But if you look at what's going on, by single cell, it's again what we're predicted. I'll cut to the chase here. These are the T cells. You increase the CD4, these ICOS positive cells here. If you look down here again, you've lost the exhausted cells, but you've got a lot more of the effector type CD8s. Forgot those were there. Anyway, if you look at the myeloid cells, though, this just shows all the myeloid cells, again, single-cell RNA. These are the suppressive kind of macrophages up here. These are the stimulatory types down here. And after you give CTLA-4 blockade plus this ICOS signaling, you lose almost all of the inhibitory myeloid cells, and you end up only with the stimulatory ones left. So you've completely remodeled the myeloid cell population to make it work better. So we look more closely now that we have the ability to do spatial omics, and with the help of Gary Nolan and others, and Pam showed this briefly earlier, one of the things that Mehdi Shaib in the lab discovered was these structures in mice that are treated with anti-CTLA-4. These are actually tetrads, where you can see here in the center of it is the dendritic cell, a DC1 dendritic cell, a CD4 cell in blue, a CD8 cell in red, and you can see their membranes are fused because now the ICOS is just sort of flowing between all the cells and having its biological effects. And this shows some more of it out here. But if you look and see where the tetrads are with CTLA-4 by itself, again, you get these. You don't get them hardly at all with PD-1 because I'm not going to spend time on the data, but that CD4 that's in there is the ICOS positive one. The conventional cells, the CD4s without ICOS, don't go in here. And if you give CTLA-4 and PD-1, because it expands everything, you can see you get a lot more of these triads. And so we've been looking at the clusters that are there, and just, let's see, this one. Again, this is showing that it's those ICOS positive cells and not the conventional cells that are in there. And if you look at the dendritic cells, again, that are in, sorry, this is going to a different point. I'm sorry, you're doing this so fast. But this, again, just shows that it's the ICOS ligand cells in the dendritic cells that are forming these clusters, not cells that don't have dendritic cells. Now, this has a profound effect on CD8 cell differentiation. And those who are familiar with the data know that John Wherry and others have shown that once activated, CD8 cells go through this thing. They start off with high TCF, this survival factor, and end up with TOX, but the memory cells have TCF. But if you look at the cells, the CD8 cells that are in those tetrads with the dendritic cells, they have high TCF, the ones that are in there, and if you go 50 microns away, they begin to become cells that expressed only TOX. So those cells in there are getting either initially primed to hold that TCF, or they may be reversing the expression of the other molecules and pulling it back. But that is why we're getting better quality CD8 cells because of the formation of these. I think I'll skip this. This just makes that point a little bit more. As you go away from them, the T cells look less stem-like and more exhausted. And it requires ICOS ligand interactions. If you do this with dendritic cells that lack ICOS ligand, you don't see any of the biology, and you also don't see any anti-tumor effects. So we think that what's going on, this just shows that you have to have the ICOS ligand to get the effect. If you do this experiment where you replace the normal dendritic cells with ICOS ligand knockouts, you lose all the efficacy of this. Going a little over time here. So one of the things that we did then was with Pam's some of the samples that she had earlier, which showed that that TLS predicted outcome in kidney cancer. We found that the tetrads actually are even more useful in predicting who's going to respond than than the tertiary lymphoid structures. And so we think what's going on here is that CTLA-4, again, has created that CD4 cell that's got ICOS on it. You've got dendritic cells that are floating around. They have ICOS ligand because they're expecting to go to the TLS and react with the follicular T helper cell through ICOS interaction there. We think this cell, the CD4 cell, preempts it. In the smaller structures, you get gamma interferon, you prime the CD8 without having to go on to TLS structures and just jumpstart the formation of long-lived CD8 cells, which is why you get the increase in tumor killing by the two molecules. And so I'll just finish with that and just sort of say there are still other molecules that need to be investigated. Of all these here, the only ones that have made it that we weren't talking about 10 years ago is LAG3. It was approved. That has been approved is LAG3 that we were talking about. These other molecules have been around, and these are some new ones that we found. Pam talked about VISTA, checkpoint cell myeloid cells, but there are these other two things that we've been working on lately. So there's a lot more ground to work on in this area to make these therapies a lot more powerful, and we're continuing to work there. But our overall goal, I mean, what we've seen in standard therapies is you take a whole bunch of patients, you treat them with a drug, see if you move the median survival over and call that a success. With immunotherapy, we know from CTLA-4 and melanoma, you can get durable responses lasting decades. I mean, patients are cured in a fraction of patients. But we can do better, and our goal now is to try to get optimal survival in as many possible patients as we can. Anyway, these are the people that have done the work. Jacob Gross did some of the early work on CD28. Others contributed in the middle. The people who did this work I talked about today are mostly Mehdi Saib and Naveen Sharma. And I have to also thank Alan Carmen, who hooked us up with Niels Lomberg, a buddy of his, that we made ipilimumab. And then also Pam and the others who helped us get this through the clinic, and people at the immunotherapy platform that helped us with some of the spatial omics that we did. And with that, I'll just close and thank you. And many of you will be hiring in the future. If many of you students here come along and want to come and learn some of this for a while or stay even, we're hiring and also doing postdocs. So thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for rushing through.
Sitting here, Katie's sitting there, and
I'm in
they're going to tell us.
It depends on the.
You sit here.
What?
Ronnie, please sit here.
You want us to switch? I'm not sure why, but we're switching. Okay, it's all very precise.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Allison, for this also fantastic talk. Thank you to the four of you. This was a spectacular afternoon, and I'm sure that's going to be a few questions to the panel. I think we can go at least to one or maybe two rounds of questions. So please, who would like to ask the first question? Ali. Just a second, they'll bring you a microphone.
Yes,
no.
Hello?
Oh, hello, over here.
Can I ask?
Sir.
There's someone who has the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Great. Well, thank all of you for the inspiring talks. I have a question for Ron. Very interesting on the age study that you're in. So Vulcan Singh just published a paper in Nature showing that expression of ATF4 in a young cell makes it a lot like an old cell that becomes highly metastatic in cancer. Have you looked at the ATF4 level on your TAC treatment and also your telomerase different cells?
We haven't looked specifically, but that pathway, that process, autophagy and others is really integral to aging itself. So anything that's going to manipulate that would be relevant, but we haven't looked specifically.
Yeah, so we want to look with the TAC and ATF4 to see what happens.
Yeah.
It's very similar to their story.
And also important for neurodegeneration as well.
Thank you very much. Next question, please.
Hi, Antonio Paiva, consultant histopathologist and PhD student here at Algarve. Salivary gland tumors, carcinomas in particular, the malignant epithelial tumors, are rare, heterogeneous, and many are immune cold. What would be the best strategy to make them responsive to checkpoint blockage? Inflame the tumor microenvironment, maybe?
Would like to answer?
Yeah, I think that would be one of the best ways. Again, you need to create some inflammation and tumor cell death, whether it's radiation therapy or an oncolytic virus or something to allow that just to prime the immune response, and then maybe come in with anti-CTLA-4. A lot of times people try to combine with anti-PD-1 rather than with anti-CTLA-4, but anti-PD-1 works much later in the T-cell differentiation process. Anti-CTLA-4 works at priming. So I think anti-CTLA-4 would be a better combination therapy.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Next question, please. There's a question up there. Please go ahead, Noon.
So, I can tell you that I am a cardiologist, I'm not an oncologist. But I will ask you something that I saw on the last years and want your opinion. Are we transforming cancer on a chronic disease, or are we curing patients with the new treatments of the immune system?
Yeah, that's a great, I mean, it depends on how you define cure. If cure means there's not a single cancer cell in the body, then I don't know. But we've at least reached an equilibrium where the immune system is holding it down where you can't detect it in those patients. So, I don't know, but I know from talking to Sharon is that she doesn't care, after about 5 years, so. But it's an important point, but I don't think we're going to answer it right now. But I think then you're armored if you respond.
I think in some patients there are curative therapies. So I do think in some patients you're seeing cure. That as an oncologist we use the word cure because we don't see any detectable cancer cells by any assays that we can measure. But I do think in some setting maybe we'll settle for having a chronic disease such like high blood pressure, where you take a pill and you control the blood pressure, but if you stop the pill, the blood pressure comes back. So it may be this way for some cancers as well. We also would like to think of preventative cancer vaccines to try and get to that point as well. So I think, there will be differences for different types of cancer, and again, more personalized, especially with the cancer vaccines.
Thank you. Bill would also like to comment?
Well, first of all, I agree with the comments from both my colleagues. Regarding it's a bit of a semantic distinction in some cases. I think there are certainly some cancers now where either the cancer is not measurable, or if it is measurable, it's completely asymptomatic and completely controllable, and patients will live a normal lifespan. I also agree that to get durable cures, we're almost always going to have to engage the immune system. Where I would differ slightly is, I would say in terms of precision drugs directed against the cancer cell itself that cause the cancer cell to either die or at least behave, I think too often we're using these wonderful drugs as single agents, and I think the experience in tuberculosis and the experience in AIDS tells us that we really need to combine drugs, and that was in one of Jim's slides. So I think we need combinations of drugs against the cancer cell itself, and then we have to intelligently engage the immune system to do the cleanup.
Exactly. And in many times, these oncogenes actually regulate immune regulatory molecules. Right.
Other questions? So the microphone.
Yes, I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for your presentations. I think the work of your lives is very humbling. This is more a question for Dr. De Pino concerning anti-aging, and more of a philosophical one, but a very serious question, which is, I think of aging as probably what we call the natural cause of death. So, do you think that at some point we will be able to reverse aging? And if so, does that mean we are at the front door of immortality? Because I cannot begin to think the consequences for the human race, but it's a real question.
Yeah, the answer is we don't know yet. You're going to need randomized controlled clinical trials with any particular therapeutic modality, anti-senolytics, epigenetic reprogramming, or maybe TERT activator compounds, all of which are going to be entering into clinical trials soon, or are in early stage clinical trials. So we don't. The answer is we don't know. At least we have genetic proof of concept, and we have several different strategies that have given us genetic proof of concept at the preclinical level that the aging process and aging hallmarks are malleable, that they can be reversed, eliminated, and so on. With respect to immortality, lifespan is different from health span. Our research is focused on health span. We want more years of healthy living, and the mechanisms that drive those aging hallmarks are the same mechanisms that drive Alzheimer's, drive cancer, and other maladies of aging, and so on. So our focus is really to essentially intercept those diseases by impacting on the aging process itself, and so on. Lifespan is different from health span. To increase lifespan is pretty fixed in organisms. Mice, 3 years of age, tortoises, 200, humans, 100 to 120, right? Lifespan is more linked to metabolic rate, metabolic processes. So you really would have to impact the metabolic process in order to have an extension, in lifespan. So slow things down, turn the oven down, and you might be able to increase lifespan in a species by manipulating those pathways, particularly the PI3 kinase pathway, and you might increase things by 50%, et cetera. But ultimately, you get into this feed-forward loop of genotoxic stress, mitochondrial decline, and so on, which happens in these super-agers where they do really well for many years and then have a very sharp decline. And so that's where these other mechanisms kick in that lead to organismal termination.
Thank you.
Hi, great. It was a great afternoon. This is for Padma and Jim. You made a great case for combining anti-CTLA-4 with anything, let's say. And of course, in melanoma, we know the advantage of combining with anti-PD-1. So what's your take on why on other cancer types the combination has not added as much to anti-PD-1 monotherapy, for instance?
I think most of the times the clinical trials are being designed with thinking that anti-CTLA-4 and anti-PD-1 are interchangeable. People group them together like immune checkpoint therapy all at the same time. They don't think about the distinct biology associated with them. That's one. The second is that anti-CTLA-4 have more frequent toxicities associated with it compared to anti-PD-1. And so that's the other reason that people prefer to choose an anti-PD-1 to avoid this sort of, toxicity issue. But, I do think those toxicities are mostly manageable. And anti-CTLA-4 gives you the best memory response out of either of those agents. So you want to implement an anti-CTLA-4. Also, I think when anti-CTLA-4 was started, Bristol Myers Squibb developed it as a Q3 weeks for 4 doses. And I don't know that 3 weeks is necessary. It could go to 6 and, maybe even later. And do you need 4 doses? Because in the neoadjuvant therapies, we show you can only use 2 doses and still get some good responses. So I think those things still have to be figured out. So we minimize the toxicity, but keep the benefits of anti-CTLA-4.
Thank you.
I think I'm going to jump in with a quick question for Bill. I was just wondering, thinking about belzutifan, for example, just wondering what your perspective is on the future in terms of treating, like using it in other solid tumors, for example, where there might be areas of hypoxia that are actually also affecting the immune function.
Yes, it turns out that HIF2, which I referred to as sort of the poor cousin of HIF1, its expression is much more restricted. So when we talk about HIF, we're often thinking HIF1, and HIF1 is expressed in virtually every cell in the body. The expression of HIF2 is much, much more restricted, and so far we don't know that there's going to be a role for the HIF2 inhibitors in tumors other than the tumors you see in von Hippel-Lindau disease. Now, having said that, one open question is there are some immune cells that express HIF2, and I think we're still learning what the net effect of modulating HIF2 is going to be on the immune system. So I think that's an area that needs a lot of investigation. There are people trying to develop inhibitors against HIF1, but there I think the evidence, I think it was Linda was referring to credentialing targets, validating targets. You know, one thing that I've learned is genetics doesn't lie, and that's true in all therapeutic areas, not just cancer. So we had pretty good genetic evidence eventually that HIF2 was a driver in kidney cancer. I don't really know which cancers depend the most on HIF1 because we don't have that sort of genetic smoking gun we had in kidney cancer.
Thank you. We have a
So
question.
I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Luis Castelo Branco. First of all, I would like to congratulate the organizing committee for this outstanding conference. I mean, this is really not normal anywhere in the globe having this group of expertise in the same room. So I think we should be all blessed by having you sharing all this knowledge with us. And my question will be directly about the spatial omics. I love the concept, and I think it's quite important by a few reasons. And one is that immune system is it's a community that interacts in so many ways. Some we already know, other ways we are far from understanding well, but this is the way to go. And the spatial omics is already helping, and I'd love to see those slides. So my question is about CD4 specifically on that. If you are distinguishing or what we are doing to look at the types of CD4 that you are having on that spatial omics, and because you know the different types of CD4 may have a different role depending on the type of tumor, depending what we're talking about. So I'm wondering if you are looking at that, and if so, how you're looking at that.
Yeah, the spatial transcriptomics and spatial proteomics platform have, you know, thousands of genes. The spatial transcriptomics are 6,000 plus genes, so you can really differentiate the specific type of CD4s that we're looking at, whether it's a CD4 with TBET, which is a Th1, or CD4 with GATA3, TFH, or CD4 with ROR gamma, which is a Th17, or CD4 with FOXP3, which is the Treg. So, I mean, we're very carefully looking at the different subsets and trying to understand how they interact with all of the different cells. You can also overlay the single cell TCR-seq, so you can see which T cell clone is, you know, associated with each of these differentiation processes for the CD4s. So I think these platforms do give you a lot of ability to look at each individual subset closely.
You are doing it now and
yes.
correlating
yes.
with the outcomes.
Yes.
You're looking at outcomes versus the different types of CD4 that are there.
Absolutely.
Okay,
But if I could just follow on, as an old-fashioned reductionist biologist, every once in a while a technology comes along that becomes the flavor of the month. Now, I learned from my mentor, every good experiment starts with the question. I'm the first to admit, and you saw some good examples of this, for some questions, spatial transcriptomics is the answer. That is the technology. But don't run into the trap or fall into the trap of chasing the latest, shiniest toy that scientists are playing with. And in particular, I would avoid indiscriminate use of these technologies because you wind up measuring lots of correlations. But if you're not trained to do the hard work of establishing causation, you wind up playing what I call the blind men and the elephant. You're measuring things that are going up and down and touching, but you don't really know what's what. So if you're going to use these technologies, get the training to use them appropriately and in the context of a question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. I couldn't have said that better.
Thank you. Over there, please.
Yeah, can I go? Okay. So we know that tumor has a lot of heterogeneity. We have a lot of different types of tumors from different tissues, also different subtypes. My question here is to get your opinion. Do you think that we are ever going to find a common targetable factor between these different types of tumors? And do you think that that lies in the immune part of the tumor?
Who's that for? The question is, will we ever cure all cancers, basically? No, I don't think so. But I think it's too complicated for anything that we understand right now to be able. It's such a complicated disease, as you've heard. There may be some commonalities that will emerge, but I can't imagine that we're going to be able to do away with it. We'll get a lot better at curing it.
When I was a clinical doctor, we used to say there were two types of clinical doctors. They're the lumpers, who always look for the commonalities, and the splitters, who are always looking for the differences. So in cancer, if you like to be a splitter, you can do that forever, and you could ultimately throw up your hands and say, no two patients' tumors are the same. And of course, on one level, that's true. But I think there are commonalities that are emerging. There are certain genetically defined pathways that we see over and over. So I'm more of a lumper than a splitter. So I think in the end, I also come back to genetics doesn't lie. So I think we are learning which pathways are important in the common tumors based on genetics. And so I am hopeful, like Jim, that there'll be some commonalities, and I think we'll be able to leverage that to go across different tumor types. But in the end, I think it's important for the non-scientist to understand this is one of the reasons this is such a battle, because we do have to learn the rules for the different types of cancer, and so that's why it's taking far too long, but we're getting there.
Although TERT can maintain your telomeres and alleviate immune senescence and enhance immune surveillance, so hey, only kidding. No, I agree with what was said.
Okay, thank you. Maybe one more question, maybe two questions?
In the first place, I'd just like to commend how this session has been excellent session. And maybe, I'm not sure if I'm a lumper or a splitter, but I'm a surgeon and I'm dedicated to breast cancer. And here, I've been noticing that we've been speaking about aging, the aging process, and how that contributes much to the development of cancer, the mutations, et cetera. Now, we have been noticing a shift towards younger women and with cancers and very heterogeneous cancers. They're very complex cancers. We've noticed this in the last 5-10 years. And I'm wondering here if we have been looking towards more epigenetic phenomenon, because we've been doing we do genetic testing to all our patients, and the majority are not mutated. They're not genetically mutated. So what is happening? How are we approaching this? Some of them do fare with immune therapy. They do fare better, but there's something here that's missing, and I'm wondering, and we have such an excellent panel here in front of us, if there are any thoughts about this.
Yeah, I agree with you. In the clinic, I'm seeing the same things. Our patients with renal cell cancer, our patients with bladder cancer, our patients with colorectal cancer, they're much younger now than they were 10, 15 years ago. We're seeing patients in their 30s and 40s with stage 4 disease, and this is very worrisome. So I do think that there's this epidemic of younger patients showing up with cancer, and we're trying to understand it. One of the things that we're noticing is that there's definitely a shift in diet for how these patients grew up and what kind of diet they may have had. And we do think that diet affects your microbiome, and your microbiome affects your immune response. And so there is this thought that could be part of the reason that we're seeing this shift. There are lots of other hypotheses out there that are being tested as well. One of the ones I recently heard is that sleep and your circadian rhythm and the amount of sleep that this generation is getting compared, it also affects immune responses. So a lot of hypotheses being tested, and I think we'll see maybe a few of these play out and hold up as to why we might be facing this dilemma now, and we will have to make adjustments. One of the adjustments I've been hearing is increasing the fiber content that people have in their diet to try and reset the microbiome in some way. So I don't have all the answers, but I agree with you wholeheartedly that there are definitely shifts in the age of these patients that we're seeing now.
Thank you.
And I'm just hoping the students heard that question because it was a great question. And one of the things I was talking to the students about at lunch was I think one of the things you get from your mentor is having scientific taste or instincts or intuition for what's a good problem to work on. What sounds intriguing? What sounds like a good puzzle? And what sounds like it could be important? So that would have checked all the boxes. So maybe you listen to something like that, or maybe you have a similar observations of your own and another problem, but that's how it starts. And then hopefully you formulate some hypotheses. You heard a couple, like maybe it's the microbiome. I don't know if it is or isn't, but that's testable. Yeah. But that's how we make progress.
And it's a very good example, just mentioning the microbiome alone. This is a continent of biology that is central to almost all aspects of our physiology that we were completely unaware of when Bill and I started our careers, right? So what else are we not seeing, right? So looking at this with an open mind and really thinking about outside the box and really thinking about what is possible, alternative mechanisms, and so on, I think is one of the most exciting things about biology. You're the explorers of today. This country, 500 years ago, connected the world because there were explorers with courage who basically connected the world and really helped us, bring cultures and languages and ideas together. You are today's explorers. You're the Magellans. You're the Vasco da Gamas of today. And so...
Thank you so much. I think with this I should just
I know.
close.
We can.
I think we had a phenomenal time. I think people now need to get ready for what's coming next. And so I hope that you had a great afternoon and enjoyed at least as much as I did. Today we had, as you could see, the opportunity to hear and interact with world leaders in cancer research. These 4 talks were both didactical and very, very, very inspiring. Thank you very much. This was really a phenomenal moment. But I cannot close this event without thanking the ABC meetings and Diana's team for all the great work and dedication they had. Thank you very much. So, in the name of the University of Algarve, and I believe in the name of the Algarvians, I thank again Professor Scalen, Sharma De Pino, and Alison for flying all the way from the US to the Algarve and providing us with this magical afternoon. Thank you. I hope you stay in the Algarve, and I hope you come back, and I hope and we always be here for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Sorry for going over.
Thank you so much. You guys did an amazing job. Sorry.